Hello, everyone. I am here with the one and only Jared Taylor. We have been chatting before this went live, but now it's in front of a couple hundred people apparently, which I guess that should affect me, and I guess psychologically maybe it does. But Jared, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Now, contrary to popular belief, not all white people know each other. So how is it that you and I know each other?
Through the internet, I would imagine. You wrote you made a very favorable video about me, which
Mhm.
was sent to me by a mutual admirer. And that's how I learned about you. And so I wrote to thank you for endorsing me. Or maybe endorsing is a little too hard a word, but for saying favorable things about me. It happens rarely enough so that I notice.
Oh, well, so the title of the video wasn't Taylor 2020, Taylor Trump. So
Right.
we did not meet shopping for tiki torches. Is that what you're telling me?
Oh, well, I didn't really have that even in mind. I've never bought
Okay.
a tiki torch myself,
Okay.
and I don't even own a little white pointy hat either.
Well, the reason I wanted to make that video was because, I've been interested in your content. And at first, like any liberal, and I'm a liberal Democrat, you hear about Jared Taylor for all the wrong reasons. And so
Mm.
you have this cloud of, all this toxic labeling. And so I said, I want to see for myself. And I was waiting, always waiting to find a smoking gun, and it never showed up.
I keep it well hidden.
Yeah, and another interesting thing is, and I've been going back through some of your old interviews and appearances, and these videos hold up, and it just shows how embarrassing the climate on race was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. But you've been saying the same message.
That's right. I'm a bit of a broken record, really. I've been saying basically the same things for 25 years. But as you say, it's astonishing the extent to which you can say the most benign things about race, but so long as they are not considered kosher or orthodox, then you're a hate monger and neo-Nazi. And this has been going on practically unchanged up till now. Although I do note that there is at least more of an opportunity for people to find out for themselves. Back in the print era, people couldn't find out for themselves really, but the
Mm.
internet has opened up much larger audiences to people who can actually, if they're curious, find out what I think and say.
How unfortunate is it that you are probably the worst vessel to spread this message, being a rich, older, educated white male, straight? I mean, this is like you are the perfect storm of what they want to hate.
I wish I were rich. That would make
Uh,
it perfect. uh, I once on the Phil Donahue program. This was
mhm.
nearly 17 or 18 years ago. I
Oh,
was joking about how no, I'm not all that keen on diversity. I'd rather that all my neighbors were rich, white, and good looking. And I remember somebody in the audience said they'd never let you in. I thought that was pretty
oh,
good.
I
You
watched
would,
that. That's a
yes.
very interesting interview. My goodness. And you
Uh,
are in enemy territory so often. You're always
mm.
having road games. Does that ever wear on you? Do you ever just want to speak with people who are like-minded?
You know, it used to be very well. It used to bother me when I was treated like a moral leper. I would talk to someone for maybe an hour and try to make my points as reasonably and as plausibly as possible, and yet every question would just be dripping with contempt. And it was clear that they thought that I was really the moral equivalent of a child molester or
Yeah.
a wife beater, and it got very wearing. But I wouldn't say I've gotten accustomed to that, but I just shrug it off. It happens so frequently.
Yeah.
Uh, and
It actually, sorry, it just reminds me, like, were you ever invited on Jerry Springer? Because that was the same era. And I would imagine they would put you next to a Klansman or a neo-Nazi.
it may be that I seem to recall being invited, but I chose not to appear
Mm,
because of precisely that kind of framing.
yeah.
They really wanted me. Well, what they're really looking for is a guy with a swastika chiseled into his forehead and missing his teeth and unable to pronounce white correctly.
Yeah.
Uh, yes, that's
Well,
what they're looking for.
I always felt that Charles Manson had a bum rap for his parole hearings because of that swastika on his forehead. It was always a hard sell to say he's ready for society.
People have certain negative stereotypes about certain symbols. That's right.
I was actually shocked to see the swastika walking around Korea. It was just used in advertisement. I mean, obviously not the Nazi connotation, but
no.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, these appearances, the premise is that you're an evil monster. It's not even up for debate. It's the beginning of the interview. Like I think Donahue said, so Jared Taylor is a racist, and you scoffed at it. You're like, oh God, here we go. And it's the same in your Wikipedia. That your Wikipedia is riddled with lies and slander.
Well, it's littered with characterizations, and if someone calls me a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi, it is a fact that someone has called me that. Now, that's not something that I think it is an accurate characterization by any stretch of the imagination, but that is Wikipedia's choice for telling the entire world who I am. Yeah, you can find lots and lots of people who've called me a white supremacist. And one of the most frustrating businesses of being a proponent of dissident ideas is that it is such a low yield enterprise when you're talking to journalists. I can talk to journalists for a half an hour and try and explain why calling me a white supremacist is just simply inaccurate, simply inaccurate. That's a historical term that had a meaning at a certain time when there were white people who wanted to rule over and dominate people of other races. But I don't know of anyone who shares that view now. And there may be such people, but I think that's a term that should just be retired.
Exactly.
And they can't come up with any reason to disagree with me. And yet, when the story appears, it's Jared Taylor, white supremacist. They've just got this boneheaded view that they must refer to me using certain terms. But I keep plugging along, and every now and then, you can get someone to call me something as relatively mild as a white separatist. That's not a term I use myself, but
well, yeah, language is so important in this. It seems minor, but it is very powerful. People summarize your entire being with just the word, the label, and they're done. They've moved on.
Well, when you think about the way the abortion debate is characterized, people are not pro-abortion, they're pro-choice.
Right.
And they're not anti-abortion, they're pro-life. And the way you are characterized is hugely important. I call myself a white advocate. Now, that's an invented term, and it's not as though it's a popular term, but it's something that seems to me is intuitively meaningful to people. They will realize that I'm talking about race, probably. I'm not talking about house paint or choosing interior decor colors. But that's what I consider myself to be. And that, to me, is a perfectly legitimate role to play. Every other group has its own advocates. Every other group has its own institutions and publications and people who stick up for their own interests. And I think whites deserve that kind of opportunity just to defend their legitimate interests too. But no, the whole idea, of course, is to use a word like white supremacist because in most people's mind, that is associated with slavery and lynching and Jim Crow, with an era in which there really was a movement among white people to exploit and dominate people of other races. You could call the European colonial enterprises in Europe and Asia white supremacist undertakings, but that's all over. That's finished. And yet, I've noticed that over the last maybe 10 years, more and more lefties are describing the entire United States society as not just deeply racist or institutionally racist, which is the terminology they used to use, but now we are white supremacist. We are steeped in white supremacy. Yes. So
you should do a search, a Google Trends search on the phrase white supremacy. It's hysterical. It only crops up in 2017, 2016. And it's a flat line. So they are the ones who want there to be white supremacy. Also, do a search for KKK, the same trend you'll notice. I mean, it is crazy that they need the enemy so that they can be the hero.
Yes.
And
well, Yes, of course. There is nothing more gratifying to those on the left than waving the bloody shirt of racism. And I don't think liberals can ever be happier than when they have what they conceive to be a genuine racist or white supremacist in their crosshairs.
Mm.
It's an orgasm of self-righteousness. Just the excitement that
Mhm.
they have. Oh, we found a real one.
Well, this is my favorite part of any Jared Taylor interview is when they ask you questions and you're answering them very reasonably, and the interviewer is agreeing with you, and they can feel themselves agreeing with you. So they sort of abort that line of questioning, and then they'll ask you a pathetic and desperate attempt at a gotcha question, like, "Are you in favor of the Nazis, or do you even think there was a Holocaust?" And they're just
Right, right.
hoping that you're going to fall into this trap or say the wrong thing, and of course, you never do.
Well, one of my favorite answers under those circumstances is once people have decided that you are a dissident on any question, they're
Mhm.
hoping to show that you are a goofball or some kind
Mhm.
of weirdo on every other possible question. And so one of the favorite questions is, well, what are your views on gay people? And my favorite answer is, well, I wouldn't want my daughter to marry one.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, they just need to discredit you because I think that you are the messenger of what is happening today. And they don't like what's happening today. They don't want to see it for what it is. And I think you are someone who speaks unpopular truths. And I've compared you, I did in my video, to Galileo. I mean, Galileo was saying something true but unpopular. And I see you in the same role.
Well, that's enormously flattering, of course, but I'm by no means the only person who's talking about these things, and that
Mhm.
is a huge difference from 25 years ago when I did and undertake this career as an American dissident, and I find that hugely encouraging. Uh, now, of course, there are strong forces that seem to be wanting to shut down our access to the internet, which is really the key to any kind of dissident movement today, is
Mhm.
access to YouTube and Twitter, Facebook, all of these places that are being increasingly made inaccessible to us. But compared to 20 years ago, more and more and more Americans realize that this vision we're supposed to have of this happy kumbaya multiracial future in which we're all eventually going to be cafe au lait happy people and we'll all
Mhm.
hold hands and sing and the sunset will come and there will be peace on earth, harmony and happiness. That's just not working out that way.
Yeah.
This civil rights era in which black people were going to be treated like white people, and then we're going to start behaving exactly like white people, and
Mhm.
diversity was going to be this enormous strength for America. It's just not happening. And people use this term red pill to explain a process whereby the scales fall from their eyes. Well, as I like to say, reality is the most powerful red pill there is. You just look around and you see that the world is not shaping up the way it was promised and the way we were constantly told it is.
And don't you think it's important to say that we would want it to be that way? Like, I would love to have everybody get along and for there not to be these problems and tribal divisions and whatnot. Do people think I want there to be an abundance of black crime and hostility towards white people? Like, this is
Well,
madness.
exactly. That's just it. I was a liberal for a very long time. I didn't arrive at these heterodox views until I was late 30s or early 40s, and it was a
Mhm.
very gradual and uncomfortable, unpleasant process. I
Mhm.
clung to liberal illusions just for as long as I possibly could, as much for that very reason. You want to think that your country is led by wise people who have chosen a good course. You don't want to think that over the last 60 or 70 years, the United States and really the West entirely has been on the road to nowhere and ultimately to oblivion. These
Mm.
are very, very unpleasant, unsettling things to think to oneself.
Yeah.
And it is just far more pleasant to think that all of this tribalism, all of this human nature that has resulted in wars and genocides and expropriations and all of these awful things, and there have been awful things. This all can be overcome, that we will transcend tribalism. Ultimately, I like to draw the comparison between communism and the current view of racial egalitarianism. It was a very attractive idea to think that we were
Mhm.
all going to live from each according to his ability to each according to his need. What more high-sounding, inspiring slogan can one come up with? And they tried it. They tried it very seriously in a number of different countries, but it failed because it was a misreading of human nature.
Yeah.
And I believe that what we are trying now is an attempt to build societies once again on a misreading of human nature, that race can be made not to matter, that race can be defined irrefutably as something that's just all in our minds, has nothing to do with biology.
Yeah.
And therefore, once we've gotten over this stumbling block, then we can build this great and wonderful society. But it's part of human nature. It would be like trying to build a society on the assumption that all men and women are going to behave the same.
Right.
This too, it's a misreading of human nature.
Well,
And
I think it is wishful thinking, and I think
yes.
I think that a lot of people would hope that it would sort of work out for the best. Like we could just fade to black and, walk off into the sunset. So, for example, when, I don't know, Bill Clinton, he went on Arsenio Hall and he played the saxophone, and oh, wasn't it sweet because the white president he's down with the black folk, and isn't that special? Or we elect Obama and oh, well, racial stuff is going to be fine now. Of course it wasn't, and why would we expect it to be? And
Yes.
even same thing with Mandela in South Africa. The mainstream media all around the world closed the book on South Africa after Mandela, and they got the new flag, and oh, the blacks and whites are going to live together and live happily ever after. Of course, that didn't happen. And it's that ugly reality rearing its head again. Somebody's got to face it at some point.
I remember, I believe it was the columnist Maggie Gallagher writing in the New York Times after Mandela was released and was elected president. She said, the dispatches from the new South Africa will read like scripture, and we will have tears in our eyes as we receive them. She really thought this was the end of all unpleasantness. The evil had been destroyed. And when Barack Obama was elected, I remember going on a radio program and being interviewed by a fellow who expected the millennium. This is going to be transformational. It's very difficult to look back on the moment of his election inauguration and try to remember just the ecstasy. There was just widespread anticipation that this was the millennium. And I am remembering, I was on the phone, I was saying, well, we had something similar happen here in the state of Virginia, where I live. A black man named Douglas Wilder was elected governor. And there was a similar, but somewhat lower scale, more localized series of hosannas and rejoicings. And I said, it changed nothing. It didn't suddenly mean that black people started marrying the mothers of their children or committed less crime. It didn't suddenly mean that white people want to have Mexican neighbors. It didn't change anything at all.
Yeah.
And the election of Barack Obama is not going to change those things either. The interviewer accused me of bad faith, of trying to mislead the public. He was so shocked that I would take what, in retrospect, of course, was a perfectly realistic point of view. He was angry that I should even bring up historical parallels and try to explain, no, human nature has not changed.
Right, and it's kind of sad that people would think that electing a black president would cure problems that have gone on for hundreds of years and are massive in scale. This is a Band-Aid, and it's not. Now, like, I love Obama. I thought he did a great job, but I mean, I had my criticisms. When who was it? Some young black kids got killed, and he said, these kids look like, if I had a son, they would look like this kid, so therefore it really hits home with me.
That was Trayvon Martin.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, that was not helpful at all. But I think it's a reflection that this is clearly not a white supremacy nation, the fact that we would elect a guy like that. And also, here's my question for all the people on the far left who think this way, and the blacks who like to talk about white supremacy. What is the difference, the precise difference between white supremacy and white majority? I think they think something's wrong with white majority, period.
Well, that's an excellent question. One of the unearned privileges that white people are supposed to have is that we can turn on the television set and we can see authority figures that look like us. If you're living in Nigeria and you turn on the television set, you see authority figures that look like Nigerians.
Right.
The same in Japan. It's simply the fact of being a majority, but it doesn't stop there. They will look at every difference in achievement between blacks and whites and say that this is, by definition, a result of white oppression.
Of course.
Because every group is absolutely equal in ability. We're just as smart and hardworking as every other group. And so if you have any detectable difference at all in per capita income or incarceration rates or admissions to Harvard or whatever it is, you're winning Oscars or Nobel Prizes, if there is a difference, it is only because of the oppression of whites. And so that's where the white supremacy idea comes in. That's where institutional racism comes in. I thought institutional racism was a particularly intriguing conception because that's what folks came up with when they couldn't find genuine bona fide individuals to point to. When I talk to lefties, I say, well, okay, if we are a white supremacist society, show me one. Show me a white supremacist who is actively grinding his heel into the face of blacks or Hispanics. And they have a very, very hard time doing that. And so they will have to blame it on this ambient miasma of evil. I think of institutional racism as somehow this wickedness emanating from the walls of buildings. It's just been impregnated in there over the centuries, and it comes seeping out and poisons black people and Hispanic people. Of course, the big flaw in looking at group differences and blaming them exclusively on white wickedness, of course, is the overachievement of Asians. But we leave that aspect completely out of this definition of any kind of black failure as being a consequence of white wickedness. Because if you really take that seriously, you have to ask, well, wait a minute. How come there are more Asians than whites at UC Berkeley, the flagship UCal? Why is Caltech overwhelmingly Asian? Why are there so many Asians in the Ivy League that they apparently have to keep them out by quota? Are Asians that have higher per capita incomes, they live longer, better health results? That's kind of odd for a white supremacist society, isn't it?
Yeah, it's weird. It's a big mystery that white supremacists, so-called white supremacists, are actually Asian supremacists. It's not really something that they can get their head around. You talked about the disparity in numbers and how they're so quick to label that or blame that on racism. I call that the racism of the gaps. Because they just need a gap, they fill it with racism and problem solved. And as far as institutional racism, every time I hear that, I call bullshit on it. In fact, I sell t-shirts that on the t-shirt says systemic systems of structural institutions, because these are just words that sound very fancy. You say systemic, people are already in agreement with you. They're like, holy Christ, that sounded educated. Don't even know what he's talking about. It doesn't exist. And like you say, we don't have the energy for it. If somebody said to me, why aren't you cheating on your girlfriend with, and having affairs? It's because I don't have the energy or the desire. And so white people don't wake up and think, Jesus, let's subjugate blacks.
Well, exactly. Well, you see, but they have tumbled to that. They now realize that it's not as though they can persuade anyone that ordinary white people or even extraordinary white people wake up every day and they spit on their hands, they roll up their sleeves, they say to themselves, how am I going to screw black people today? They realize that nobody's going to buy that. And so the real trick is to persuade white people that they are doing this whether they are intending to or not. And even if they think that they are white allies of people of color, I mean, these are all the new buzzwords now. We are trying to be white allies, but we don't realize that every day with every breath, we are participating in this white supremacist system. I've just been reading a book. It's called White Fragility. And it's about a woman who makes a living berating I beg your pardon?
Is she from Portland? I know her.
I think her last name is D'Angelo. It's an Italian name.
I know her.
Oh, do you know her? Well, she makes a living trying to persuade white people, just perfectly ordinary white people, that they are, whether they know it or not, accomplices to white supremacy. And she says they resist this. They don't like being told this. And that's because they suffer from white fragility. And time after time after time, every one of them resists.
Resistance is futile.
That's right. And she says this is proof of white fragility. It's not, in her mind, proof of the fact that she happens to be wrong. This is a cult. It's a cult. These are people who are believers.
I completely agree. Now, these white allies, if the white allies are allies to people of color, what does that make them to white people?
Oh, they should actively be traitors to whiteness. Noel Ignatieff is a fellow who lectured at Harvard. He
Hmm.
said that loyalty to humanity, no, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity, and that whiteness should be destroyed by every means possible. Now, he's not talking about white people, or at least he claims not to be, but this conception of whites, that we are somehow a different group. This is poisonous. This has poisoned history and will continue to poison the future unless we can eradicate it. No, this is a form of sick, sick, sick religion. And I know that you are an atheist, and I loved your racism of the gaps. That reminds me of the arguments about the narrowing, the dwindling role of religion as
Exactly.
science begins to fill in some of those gaps.
Mhm.
No, that's a clever formulation on your part.
Yeah, that's
But
where I
the
got it
idea,
from.
yes, yes, the idea that you can't even prove this stuff. You don't have to prove this stuff. You have to just convince people that they are full of sin. And there is a kind of tent revival aspect to it.
Yeah.
You get people all emotional. And apparently, when people come to the realization that, yes, we are accomplices to historical white supremacy, exploitation, people break down in tears. They have this emotional realization and they vow to turn their lives around. It's just like a temperance union meeting, or it's an
Mm.
extraordinary expression of human, I think, gullibility. It's a kind of it's a purely emotional reaction that reflects some kind of deep-seated desire to feel bad about
Mhm.
oneself.
Yes, I agree. And you know, so you hear about this thing, whiteness. This is a new phrase that they're bringing up to try to harness their anti-white bigotry, but do it in a way that's acceptable. So I don't hate white people, but I hate whiteness, as
Mm.
if these things are, you could separate these things, or it's just an astonishing trend I'm noticing. What do you think of that?
Well, a lot of this is so against common sense. The idea that race is a social construct, that is some kind of sociological optical illusion, that if you look at a pygmy and you look at a Dane and you put them side by side, and you're supposed to tell yourself, well, I see what appear to be physical differences. But what's really happening here is that I have racialized the Dane as white, and I've racialized the pygmy as a pygmy, and as an African. And this is all just pure sociological mumbo jumbo. What in heaven's name? Only very intelligent people can persuade themselves to believe something so spectacularly stupid.
Yeah.
But this is the whole business of whiteness as this concept that's entirely separable from being white. And if we can only destroy whiteness, then we will arrive at this kumbaya, all hold hands and walk into the sunset era that we're all supposed to be striving for.
Well, the idea that there is no such thing as race, that's a dead end, and they know it. Because who's going to sign up for that? The people of color are not down with this idea at all.
You're
So
right.
it's a two-front war for them, because we're
Yes.
not going to agree, and the people of color aren't going to agree. So who's agreeing with them on that? But they still try it because it's so uncomfortable.
You know, bit by bit, I have seen people back away from that idea
Mhm.
because the science is so irrefutable. You can separate people by genetic analysis on just a very small number of what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. You don't have to know very much genetically about someone to realize that this person is East Asian, and you can distinguish Japanese and Chinese. I
Yeah.
lived in Japan for 16 years. I can't tell a Japanese from a Korean or a Chinese. I mean, I know a lot of white people claim to be able to do that, but most Asians don't claim to do that. The DNA certainly can. The DNA knows more about you than you know about yourself. And that is why when people do these 23andMe analyses, they discover that, my gosh, where'd that Sardinian come from? You know, or where'd that East Indian come from?
Right.
The genes can tell you immediately, unerringly.
Now, I think it's important to note that race is not the beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't mean that there's not other important factors to discuss, like culture. For
Of course.
example, I'm in Argentina right now. These people vaguely resemble me. I mean, I'm from English background, but their skin is light, and I mean, generally you could call them white, but
Yeah.
I don't speak the same language, and they have a completely different culture. So there's an enormous array of differences, and those
Yes.
things still matter. It's not either
Mhm.
or. Both things really do factor in. Um, I was
Oh,
going to ask you
yes.
about this term white advocate, because
Mhm.
I do think that this is a much more watered down term, and I think it's a vast improvement on the term racialist, which you tried to use at some point. but that sounds far too close to racist to be of any use.
Well, I never really used racialist with any enthusiasm, and probably
Okay.
used that to describe myself once or twice. No, it's not a very good word. People don't know what it means, and as you say, it sounds very much like racist. Of course, these days it's hard to know what the word racist means, but we all know how it feels. It's immoral to be a racist, whatever that word may happen to mean.
Exactly.
And of course, I love the idea that only white people can be racist because that is prejudice combined with power.
Mm.
And so, if you're walking through Detroit at night and you're called a white MFer and somebody sticks a knife into you, at least as the life drains out of you, you can take comfort in the fact that this was not a racist attack.
Well, I remember there was a story that Beyonce and Jay-Z, something came up about their child, and I don't know, they might have said some remarks, and somebody called it racist, and they said, no, they can't be racist. Racism is prejudice plus power. And I'm like, these people are billionaires, and you're still not going to give them the authority to be racist? Unbelievable. But as far as the phrase white nationalist, white separatist, yes, I think I've narrowed down why people have a problem with it. And it's not the nationalist or the separatist part, it's the white part. I think the word white is so triggering that yes, anything that follows it is just, it's verboten. You cannot say white and get away with it.
Do you remember a campaign that had a brief vogue, maybe 6 months ago, of people putting up little signs on college campuses that said, it's okay to be white?
Oh, yes, I remember this.
I thought that was brilliant. I wish I'd come up with that.
Yeah.
And whenever you put that up, the administrations would talk about hatred and white supremacy and sowing bigotry. You could send college administrators into just conniptions simply by suggesting that it's okay to be white.
Well, I've tried to push this forward. I've tried to say it's now awesome to be white. I mean, that's obviously a joke. I see what they were doing there, but it's so much more than neutral to be white. It's not just okay. It's perfectly awesome to be white. And likewise, it's awesome to be black and brown, Hispanic, Asian. If I were any of those races, I would feel the exact same way. I think that point is lost on a lot of people.
Yes. And for us, it is perfectly, we are required to say, I'm black and I'm proud is a fine expression of racial solidarity, or brown pride, or gay pride, or whatever it is. It's only white people, only white people. And this has been one of the themes of my 25-year career in this, is how utterly, utterly one-sided and dangerous this double standard is. All non-white countries, it's perfectly all right for them to take measures to preserve their traditional majorities. Nobody is asking the Mexicans to initiate an immigration policy that's going to reduce them to a minority, or the Turks, or the Algerians, or the Congolese, or even the Japanese. It's all okay for the Japanese, bless their little souls, to want their country to remain Japanese. It's only if you're talking about white people. A Frenchman who says, I want France to remain French. Oh my God, he's a white supremacist. He's a neo-Nazi. He may be just a Nazi even without the neo on. And why only white people? Why only white people? This is a question that is never answered because in polite circles, the question is never asked.
Well, I think there was an interview I saw recently of a black guy from Poland. I think he was a soccer player, somebody famous. And they were asking him, what do you think of this far-right movement of these people in the streets of Poland talking about Poland for the Poles and this kind of thing? And they were trying to bait him into saying, yeah, these people are all racist scum.
Yeah.
He said, yeah, that doesn't offend me. And they said, why? And he said, because I'm Polish. Like I consider myself Polish, so I don't find a problem with it. So I mean, where do you stand on that? I mean, assimilation is possible. There's such a thing as national identity.
Assimilation is possible if you're talking about very, very small numbers. But I don't know where this fellow, he was an African who is a Polish citizen and a soccer player.
Exactly.
Once there are enough Africans from his country, or even just Africans in general, but sub-Saharan Africans, there will be a centripetal force of a different kind of identity. You find that wherever you go. And the numbers can depend on what the circumstances are. What I find is that we get messages here at American Renaissance from people all over the world who are not white, who, because they have an understanding of their own sense of loyalty, their own sense of comfort in being a subcontinental Indian, or from China, or from Africa. They will say, I understand exactly what you're saying, and you have absolutely the right to be who you are, and only you can be who you are. So don't let the white man disappear. There are many people. You would be surprised. I've kept a file of these. I should publish these. I don't like to call them love letters, but these communications from non-whites who are saying, I support you exactly what you're doing. White people have done wonderful things through history. We don't want you to disappear.
Exactly.
In my
Well,
experience,
uh-huh.
it is much easier for me to explain my views to any randomly selected black person than to any randomly selected white person, because
That's
black
very
people,
interesting.
they understand race.
Yeah.
And when it's clear that I have no hostility towards them, I don't want anything for white people, and I'm not delighted to grant to people of every other race, including them, that is to say, simply to be in control of their own destiny and to be in an institution or an environment or even a nation in which they can pursue their own destiny.
Well,
That seems perfectly eminently fair, and black people understand that it's white people who are incapable of grasping that.
yeah, I heard a couple of interviews you did with a Mexican interviewer and a guy from Israel, and both times they were basically hell bent on burning you at the stake at the start, and
Oh,
then
yeah.
after you talked to them and kind of saw it from their perspective, or you made them see it, well, what would you think if this was the policy for Israel or for Mexico?
Right.
They agree with you, and then it becomes this uncomfortable thing of, oh my God, am I the monster? It's like, no, neither party are the monster. This is fine. This is just the way it is.
Yes, that's right. It's just the way it is. Again, it's like going back to the communists who really did wish to build a society on a mistaken premise.
Mm.
We are building a society on a mistaken premise, and we are reaping the consequences. And unfortunately, it is whites who, as they become a minority, and not just a minority, but a despised minority, who
Yes.
are suffering the most from this mistaken assumption about human nature. And it's something that I've been trying to stop. And as I say, this message is getting through in certainly not nearly as loudly and as clearly as I would like, but it's far better
Mhm.
than it was when I first began.
Well, I think a real conversation can begin to happen once we stop calling everyone a Nazi and a racist. We can actually
What,
discuss points and hear, listen.
but my question is, when's that going to stop? I've been
Mm.
called a racist and a white supremacist for 25 years now. I'm waiting for it to stop.
Yeah, I agree. But I think there has been progress on that. And I
Yes,
think
yes.
the internet and maybe anonymity on the internet, I'm not a big fan of it, but at least ideas can get discussed and heard out in full, like this conversation right now. And
Yes.
this would be a toxic thing. If I was in high school or college, my God, put my name to a conversation about race in an honest way, that's social suicide. Now
Yes.
it's not. So things are changing a little bit.
Well, and I think this is a reaction of those who are guardians of orthodoxies.
Mhm.
All orthodoxies lash out with particular viciousness when they are threatened or as they die. And the orthodoxy of multiculturalism and diversity as a strength, I think it feels that it is under attack in a way that was never attacked before, not just in the United States, but what's happening in Europe. And for that reason, we have this increasing movement within the United
Mhm.
States to make sure that voices like ours are not heard.
Yeah.
There's a party in Sweden called the Alternative for Sweden. It's based on Alternative for Germany,
Oh,
in
yeah.
the German party that recently got itself into parliament.
Uh-huh.
And they had a YouTube channel in which they were complaining about the fact that one of these petted and promoted foreigners has been made a news anchor, but speaks with such a heavy accent that it's hard to understand. And they said, well, don't you think that a news anchor should speak fluent Swedish? They didn't say we don't want any non-whites reading the news. They said they should speak fluent Swedish. The
Mm.
entire channel was taken down by YouTube. And
Wow.
that was one of their main, and they're furious, of course. Here is an American company that decides what is
Mm.
fit to be discussed in Sweden and what is not.
It's crazy.
And we could very well be facing a similar problem. I can't tell you how many times we have lost advertisers or
Mhm.
printers who have refused to do business with us. We've been kicked off of Twitter. We've been kicked off of Facebook. We used to have a page on Facebook of all of our credit card processing systems. People will decide that we're evil and they don't want to do business with us.
Mhm.
We sell some books on Amazon. Well, now there's a big push on. Just NPR had an article, a written article, about people complaining that those books by that evil but avuncular white supremacist Jared Taylor are still available on Amazon. This is a scandal. Will Amazon decide that my books are just not fit for polite society? And Amazon has a special program for benefits for nonprofit corporations, of which our parent corporation is. We are a nonprofit 501c3 educational institution, believe it or not. And Amazon has special portals in which you can gain a certain amount of credit by using them. And we applied for this in a routine sort of way, and they denied it. And I asked Amazon, well, why are we denied? They said, well, the SPLC has given us a list of organizations that are IRS recognized nonprofits, but we take that list, and anything on that list we just don't allow into the program.
Wow.
So the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a militantly lefty and I think extremely biased, untrustworthy group, they get to decide who gets to use this nonprofit portal. And
that is madness, and I'm glad that you persevered through all these setbacks. You mentioned Sweden, which reminds me of Little Mogadishu, which is a sub-community of Somalis over there, which is a total hellhole. But what do you think in general about pockets of peoples such as just Chinatown or Koreatowns? Is this a good thing, or should we celebrate that, or is that bad actually?
It is an inevitable thing. Let's put it that way. In my view, it is a mistake to have large-scale immigration from alien countries or alien cultures or alien religions. See what's happening in Paris or all of the Western European capitals. You have conglomerations. They certainly don't call it, Little Mogadishu. That's a rather hair-raising name for a place, given the reputation Mogadishu certainly has.
Exactly.
But you have Little Algiers, you have Little Tunis, you have Little Casablanca. And all of these places are pretty doggone disagreeable, which is why no Frenchman will live in them. And this is clearly a bad thing. For anyone to think that this is a celebration of diversity, that this enriches French society, is just a fly in the face of all the most obvious evidence.
Yeah, well, I think this raises a couple of good points, which is there's a difference between a Little Mogadishu and a Chinatown. The Muslim issue is not as problematic as, say, the Chinese, but even still, like I've been living in Melbourne recently, and Melbourne is an example of multiculturalism, but it tends to work because it's mostly whites and Asians. And even having said that, there are still white people there, and with good reason, who are a little bit perturbed, a little bit not so happy about the number of Chinese people that have taken over downtown and have bought up all the land, and it's basically turning into a reflection of China. It's not really what Melbourne used to be. And even though these are brilliant people, they're perfectly fine, they are not criminal in nature, by and large, but there's still an issue. Because do we want to import just, the best and brightest from around the world so that they swamp our numbers? Is preserving your people still important, even if the people coming in are just amazing and awesome, but happen to be from a different culture? Shouldn't you still be worried about your culture?
As I have said, I wouldn't care if the newcomers were all 10 feet tall and had IQs of 200 and could fly or photosynthesize. I have the right to want my way of life, my tribe, my traditions to persist. And if we're talking about untouched peoples in the Brazilian jungle, or if you're talking about folks who live in the hills of New Guinea and Irian Jaya, people understand that. We might think that those folks, by any kind of objective criterion, live primitive and perhaps not very enriched lives, and yet they have the right to remain as they are, even though some people might think, well, they might benefit from Italian opera, or they might benefit from Japanese sushi. Well, if they don't want it, why force it on them? Why make them change? But in our case, no, we are not allowed to remain who we are.
Of course not. Now, do you think the cult of multiculturalism or diversity, why does that not apply to Harlem? Don't you think Harlem should be more white?
Well, it's becoming more white. Uh,
And
but no,
they're upset about this, yes?
yes, they are. That's all gentrification. You know, white people just can't get it right. When the blacks moved in and the whites left, that was white flight. That was bad. Now, if whites come trickling back, then that's gentrification, and that's bad too. Whatever we do, it's all our fault. It's like policing. You know, if you send police to the area where there's crime, then that's over policing and it's racial profiling. And despite the fact that the presence of police keeps a certain amount of crime down, that's bad. If you pull the police out, oh, that's depolicing. That's ignoring communities of color that require police presence. Nothing the white man can do is okay.
Right.
And it's gotten to the point where whenever I am in any kind of debate with a black person or a liberal who speaks in these terms, I say, well, okay, then if white people are so bloody hopeless, shouldn't we be allowed simply to go our own way? Let us just leave us alone.
Right.
Wouldn't black people be better off if they never had to deal with us wicked, horrible, exploitative, supremacist white people at all?
Well,
shouldn't.
let me
no, that's not good either.
I'll coin that movement for you. It's called the WGTOW, not MGTOW, which is men who go their own way, but white people who go their own way. This is, I mean, yes. See, the thing is, that's not even controversial. What you just said, the idea that white people would stay in and among white people primarily. This is what already happens. You're describing what is happening. And yet people react to it like you're suggesting ethnic cleansing or something crazy.
Well, you know, I don't know if you know the name Joseph Sobran, but he wrote for National Review for a long time. One of the most brilliant men I ever knew. He had a number of remarkable aphorisms. I wish I'd followed him around with a notepad and a pencil, take down the brilliant things that he used to just toss off. But speaking of this very form of behavior, he said he would say in their mating and migratory habits, liberals are no different from members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he's absolutely right. Where does Hillary Clinton choose to live after she leaves the White House? Chappaqua, New York. How many black neighbors does she have? You know? How much diversity does she have in her life? Same with Nancy Pelosi or all of these other champions of diversity. It's just such spectacular hypocrisy. Nobody even calls it into question. Where do they send their children to school? Where do they holiday? I mean, these lovely Kennedys, you know, who championed the immigration bill. Ted Kennedy championed the immigration bill in 1965 that is turning whites into a minority in the United States. Where did he go vacationing? The Kennedy compound is certainly not a place where Haitian boat people are going to come washing up on the beach. I'm sure those people lived a life of real whiteopia. And yet they force this completely alien experience on the rest of us who don't have the money to live in gated communities.
Yeah, the hypocrisy is palpable. And look, here's the thing. I think people want to have some diversity in their life. I don't think everybody's seeking just the most, wonder bread white experience. I mean, I've benefited from, the non-whites in my life. I grew up idolizing black people and such. But it's just, can people not abide by the golden rule? Because I think we've stumbled across the main issue, which is hostility. At its core, there is a hostility, a negative energy coming from a certain group of people towards white people. And I would say that's unjustified. Now, in retaliation, some white people now have hostility back at them. And you could call some of that justified, or some of it not justified. But now we're in a cycle, a perpetual cycle. And how does it end? Can we not end it in a peaceful way? Because it feels like it's ramping up and it's only getting worse.
Oh, I think it's unquestionably getting worse. And that is why I think that some kind of peaceful separation for those who wish to be separate is the only long-term solution.
Okay,
it's a long-term. Yes, go ahead.
Let me jump in and ask you.
Yes.
Isn't that already possible? Isn't that what we already do?
It's not. It's not possible because you cannot have an explicitly white community or institution. It can be implicitly white, but that does not protect you. ultimately, for a people to survive and for its institutions, its culture, its heritage, and its destiny to remain in its own hands, they have to have some territory that is theirs and theirs alone. That is what the Hungarians are talking about, or the Poles, when they say, no, no, thank you. We don't want Muslim communities taking root in our European Christian society.
So,
and of course, they're called all the worst possible names, but that's the only way that Hungarian society is going to remain Hungarian.
well, even though we don't have laws that can make that possible, what we do have are other mechanisms like economics. And economics act as a shield. I mean, that's essential. I lived in basically an ethno state growing up in a small affluent town in Los Angeles. And we had a couple blacks and a couple Persian and Korean, but they were super rich, and it sort of filtered the scum, but the scum of all races, you understand? So like we didn't have a criminal element because they couldn't afford to live there.
That's right. But what you're saying then is that white people who are not wealthy, they do not have that choice.
Right.
And they are stuck.
But they probably get blown away in a tornado in their trailer park anyway.
Well, but that is tremendously unfair to those people. Now, they're not necessarily folks that I would wish to be my neighbors. And yet, the folks who have neighbors who play ranchera music until midnight and who take over the baseball diamonds because they're playing soccer, or the ones who want to slaughter goats and cook them in their barbecue in the public parks and the barbecue pits, the people who have to live with that are not the fancy white liberals who pass the laws that result in all those people showing up. It's poor white folks who don't have a choice. And for them, they might have grown up in the United States, but they are now living, or they are growing old in something that is really an extension of Mexico or Guatemala or Haiti or Vietnam. They didn't choose that. I think this is the cruelest sort of trick to play on them, and then tell them, wait a minute. This is diversity. You should be rejoicing. And if you complain about this, you are a wicked racist. This infuriates people, as well it should. And I believe that at some level, it's this kind of attempted trickery that is behind at least a part of the working class white support for Donald Trump. He's not explicitly racially conscious by any means, but I think people have an instinctive sense that he wouldn't put up with something like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and yeah, the poor people are kind of crap out of luck with that strategy, but it is an effective measure. I mean, there are other places, like down in Argentina, they have private cities down here where they won't even let you in because they want to keep the riffraff out and they want to live in peace.
But see, that's just not good enough. That is not a nation.
Right.
And white people, Americans, before the arrival of large numbers of non-whites. Now, of course, we did have this problem having brought black people to the United States against their will. But you had communities all over the United States that were overwhelmingly white. And of course, there was a certain amount of crime, there was poverty, there was wealth, there was tension of one sort or another. But there was a kind of coherence to that society. Mm-hmm. If you read novels by Anthony Trollope, for example, or if you read Anne of Green Gables, Anthony Trollope wrote, of course, about British society. Anne of Green Gables about Prince Edward Island in maybe the 1920s and 30s in Canada. You have a society that is depicted in a great deal of multi-layered detail, but it is impossible to imagine those societies cohering if you had large numbers of Jamaicans or if you had large numbers of Muslims. No, it just doesn't work. So I think the people who are, of course, the worst victims of this cult of multi-this and multi-that are the very ones who can't afford to move away when the dominant language in the classroom, when the teacher's not talking, is Spanish. This is a terrible thing to force lower middle class or working class white people to submit. You go to the PTA, half the parents can't speak English, and so half the time is spent interpreting for them. Half of the school time is spent trying to teach Hondurans to speak English, and this is what they get for their taxes. No. This is actually horrible. So what you're proposing is okay for those of us with a certain amount of money, but it's just not fair. And it's a contemptuous treatment of those who cannot afford the solutions that you're describing.
Well, it's also a constant state of white flight. I mean, it's not a sustainable long-term thing, but essentially what you're describing is a failed state. I mean, America It is a new country, and it's an aspirational country. It's an experiment. There's no country. This is not how you're supposed to build a country. This is not the natural, organic way it's supposed to happen. Now, we've benefited from that. I mean, there's certain perks that come along with this. I think we'd all agree. But as a big picture kind of phenomenon, there are major flaws, major problems that other countries just do not experience. And I've traveled the world and I've seen this firsthand. And America is kind of unique in good ways and bad ways.
Well, it was certainly an experiment, and one not necessarily guaranteed to succeed, in opening the United States to immigration from various different European countries. That was rather an adventure, and it was one that was opposed by many of the original English stock. They didn't want the Irish, they didn't want the Italians, they didn't want the Hungarians. And there was a certain amount of friction in trying to absorb those different European ethnics. And if I had been living in the United States at that time, I might very well have said, no, we got to keep these Irish and these Italians out. I don't know. The fact is, it was not a frictionless undertaking, but there are studies that show that after 3 generations in the United States, there is virtually no European ethnic group that is distinguishable from others in terms of per capita income, likelihood to go to college, or likelihood to marry out of one's original ethnicity. It's a successful melting pot so long as the ingredients were European. Well, so this is really ultimately a statement about race. The parts that there were people who did not enter the melting pot who'd been here far longer than the European ethnics, namely blacks and American Indians. They're still not part of that kind of successful melting pot.
I don't think they even want to be. I think they're still psychologically traumatized and bitter about the history of it all. I mean, did you see the Black Panther, the recent movie?
I have seen the trailer. That's as far as I got.
Well, you're familiar with the concept of Wakanda,
yes,
right?
I am.
Okay, so I was watching the actors and the director talk about this. They're getting interviewed. And somebody asked, they said, if Wakanda was real, would you want to live there? And without hesitation, all of them said, oh, hell yeah, I would live there. Which is to say, I would immediately leave this white majority country in a heartbeat to be with my people in a exclusively black country.
Yes.
And it was applauded. Like this was some great theory that they've just brought up. And yet they don't do it. So there's a bit of hypocrisy with that. I mean, they're not going to trade away all that America has to offer to actually go to Africa because it's not
because Wakanda is a fantasy. If you do have an all-black society, it's not going to be a particularly agreeable society. That is something that I have suggested to blacks in encounters of this kind. I said, look, build your own Wakanda. Take responsibility for your own destiny. That is what you should be doing rather than wanting to live among whites, trying to keep whitey on the hop, asking for more handouts all the time. Go build your own Wakanda. But no, they will not do that because in their bones, they know that is not what the result would be. The result would be what we find in sub-Saharan Africa or heaven forfend in Haiti itself. These are not successes. We have examples of black communities, Detroit, we have Trenton, New Jersey, we have New York. They're not pleasant places to live. And it's not is it some sort of odd, weird coincidence that there's a certain kind of population pattern there? I used to have a certain respect for Louis Farrakhan, the Minister Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam, because they still have a publication. It's called The Final Trumpet, or The Final Call, as I recall. And one of it's on the last page, they have this list of principles. And one of the principles that they stand for is separation. They say, how can the sons of slaves live peacefully with the sons of slaveholders? They say we need to separate and take responsibility for ourselves and forge our own destiny with our own hands. But they never, ever try to implement that. This is just all, I think it's all baloney. I think Louis Farrakhan knows very well that he and his people are far better off in a society in which white people make sure that the sewers continue to work and the electricity continues to be generated and the mail gets delivered on time and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it's a for-profit industry too. I mean, these people make money with this narrative, so they actually don't want it to change. They like sort of keeping that tension alive.
Well, now, that's exactly right. Yes.
I like when people talk about blacks in America and how they're not doing so well. It always inevitably spirals down to slavery, and of course, it's white people's fault. Even though hundreds of years have passed, but it's still the excuse given. And you always bring up, well, wait a minute, let's talk about other countries outside of America, because we have tons of case studies. How are you going to explain this away every single place? And like you said, this is not a coincidence.
No,
It
no.
reminds me of, have you ever watched the Spelling Bee, the National Spelling Bee? They do an annual thing.
Oh, in which all of these subcontinental Indians are inevitably the winners? Is that
exactly? And so you and I could sit here and talk and conspire as to how can we make it ensure that next year an Indian is not going to win this, as if it matters to us at all. You and I couldn't do anything to stop this from happening because they value education, they homeschool their kids, they're just bright people and they care about this and they're going to succeed. Now, does it hurt us that Indians keep winning this? Does it affect us? Are we losing sleep over this? No. And I would, venture to say that with Black people, I want them to succeed. I would love for them. I want all my neighbors, my countrymen to succeed. I mean, if Black people all of a sudden just became the IT masters and started startup companies and were just dominating on the online space, I would be like, hooray, good for them. I'm happy. If Black crime was, dropped significantly, I'd be in favor of this. I don't understand why. I don't think they believe that, though. I don't.
The majority of white people would certainly agree with you. The huge majority. I think there are very few white people who actually actively want non-whites to fail. But there is a limit to this. If we have enough Asians and Indians coming to the United States, and if we implement pure meritocracy, they'll end up running the place. They're smarter than we are. And I don't want Harvard and Yale and MIT and all of the other institutions of the United States government, the Supreme Court, to be dominated by Asians. Well, again, as I said, that could conceivably happen. So we have to try very hard to keep them at no more than, say, what is it? The Asian quota is more or less at Harvard are maybe 15%, 20%. They're only 5% of the population, but if they get over maybe 15, 20%, that begins to look a little odd. So, you have to start holistic admissions all over again.
Yeah, racist policies towards the Asians is fine, no problem.
Yeah, well, it's not so fine. There's a suit against that.
I'm kidding, but so I guess what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, you want to intern the Japanese again?
You got it. You figured me out.
It's a problem because we interned George Takei, and he turned him gay, I think. So that it was all a big mistake. It's
no. It's just that ultimately what it boils down to is I want my group, my tribe, my extended family to survive. It's as simple as that. I want my grandchildren to look like my grandparents and to sing some of the same songs and believe in some of the same beliefs and just be part of this cultural heritage that they have that goes all the way back to Greece and Rome.
Okay.
I want my people to have a future.
And
if we,
but can I push back a little bit here?
Yes.
Okay, so I agree with that, and I think people should be speaking up for white people as a group, as an extended family. But what if your tribe was extended beyond race to something like, your alma mater? I mean, would you not consider people from Yale to be part of your tribe, regardless of race?
Not in the same way. If I'm attending a Harvard-Yale football game, then provisionally, yes, we are members of the same tribe. But my tribe, my ancestors have been white for 40,000 years. I'd like my descendants to be white for another 40,000 years, even on merely aesthetic grounds, for heaven's sake. I think.
But
I'm a true believer. What? I'm a true believer in diversity. I want there to be blondes and blue-eyed people and redheads. We will all disappear if we sort of get thrown into the multicultural melting pot.
But don't you think it is a noble pursuit and sort of the goal of civilization to seek out commonalities and extend our tribe to have more humans be included in that? So isn't that the idea of a nation state?
That's empire. That's empire. A nation state, the word nation comes from the Italian nacere, meaning to born. It's to be born. It means people who share a common ancestry, it's like, I use this term extended family with some consideration. I think that for most people, their race, people who are visibly of the same stock as themselves, are the largest group to whom they can feel an instinctive kind of loyalty. Now, if the world were invaded by aliens, then that might force a larger sense of loyalty. We would wish to sacrifice for people, just
Yeah,
humans in general, if we had this other antagonist. But given that we're not faced with such a catastrophic situation,
not yet.
people have a sense of loyalty. And the idea that we're just going to expand and expand, if it's not to be a hierarchical situation, and I think hierarchy would inevitably reestablish itself, but if it's not to be a hierarchical situation, then it is those groups like whites that are not reproducing themselves who are simply going to be bred out of existence. We will become a minority even by doing nothing. We could end immigration tomorrow. We would
Yeah,
still become a minority. And if we continue institutionally and in every possible way to encourage mixed marriage, we'll be bred out of existence. And interestingly enough, in the natural world, scientists and biologists take precautions to avoid that happening. If you
well,
have some group of alligator or some subgroup of beetle, we try very hard to leave them in a protected environment where they can be themselves. But if we're
so,
talking about white people, the heck with them, they can
are you
disappear. That's
saying
all right.
whites are an endangered species? We should be put on the list.
In the long term, certainly. If you
But
see, if whites do not have some way to draw a line and say, well, yes, this is for us, and we love you and respect you, but
mhm,
we have to have a place that's just for us, just the way we feel about our own families. My house is for me, and
yeah,
the way I can parallel my thinking about race is by explaining that I love my own children more than I love the children of strangers.
this
Now,
is
I might be very fond of the children of
mhm,
strangers, but no one objects if I make all sorts of sacrifices for my own children that I would not make for the children of strangers. I think likewise this, with race. It
mhm.
doesn't mean any kind of hostility to people of other races. One can be very fond of and have all sorts of fruitful experiences with people of other race, but one's family comes first. I think that's a fairly accurate parallel for what a normal sense of racial or tribal solidarity.
Yeah, I can see that. It makes a ton of sense. As far as birthing rates, I'm a little bit confused with that because every time that gets brought up, it's always compared to, the rate that Muslims are giving birth or blacks or Hispanics, when
Mhm.
really the issue of the white birth rate is strictly an issue with white people.
Oh
Like in
yes.
like in Denmark, they do commercials trying to encourage the young people to have sex and make babies. Um,
Unfortunately, those two are different things now. Uh, well, it the whole question of birth control is a tricky one. Birth control is inherently dysgenic because it's the smart people who plan ahead who are going to use birth control,
mm,
and it's the impulsive ones who don't, who are less likely to use it. But setting this aside, this appears to be a problem of wealth.
mm,
The Asians, the smartest Asians, are reproducing at even lower rates than most whites. In Hong
right.
Kong or in Singapore, the total lifetime fertility of the people, of the women who live there, is less, zero point 0.8, zero point 0.9. That would mean every generation the population falls in half. This is a catastrophic state of affairs. The
Yeah, but
Japanese, the cynical Japanese
uh,
have a good time calculating in the year, when is it, 2500, when the last Japanese will die.
well,
It's a fascination they have with their low birth rates.
you mix that with their suicide rate, it's a shock that there's any left, apparently. But
Well, right, but they're dwindling in numbers and they don't like it. But they are not going to restock the pond with alien fish. They want
but
Japan to remain Japanese.
I guess I'm just a little bit awestruck by the size of that problem and the glacial pace of it all.
Well,
There's 7 billion people on the planet. To be worried about extinction or birth rates seems like a problem I just can't take on board or give
hmm.
any serious energy towards.
Well, but wait,
Because,
wait.
uh,
You're assuming that human beings are all interchangeable, and
mm,
that's the problem. It's like birth control. Those who would say, "Gosh, there are too many people on the planet, so I'm going
mm,
to make sure that I have no more than one child," those are likely to be the smart, productive people. It's the not so smart, not very productive
right.
people who are filling the world with babies.
Well,
This is not a good trend.
but evolutionary success is not smart or guided in any, you know,
But
brilliant
it could
way.
be. It
It could
could
be.
be.
Isn't
So
that
far,
eugenics?
well, I think eugenics, there can be eugenics that it takes the form of a certain kind of education. And there can be eugenics that's forced and cruel. I'm not at all in favor of any kind of coercion, but there
Right.
would be nothing at all wrong in schools bringing up the fact. And there are these sex ed classes that could be classes that talk about the heritability of traits.
Okay. Well,
I don't think.
what if we encouraged the social norm of waiting till you're at least 25 to have a child? Would that not be a good thing or do you think
Not
that would be less
necessarily.
children?
No, I think certainly we should. The social norm should be you don't have a child until you're married.
Yes.
That's an obvious first step. But
That's
there are couples who are in their early 20s. And after all, probably your grandparents or your great grandparents married when they were in their early 20s, and they didn't have any difficulty with that. Norms changing all the time. Age of marriage is moving up. Age of first childbirth is moving up all the time.
but
But I do also think, now this is something that I cannot prove. This is simply a visceral sense of what's happening in the United States. But I believe many white people get this subliminal message that white people are no good. White people have been the cancer of human history. And when they look around and they see that the local grade school where they would send their children is overwhelmingly non-white, it is a discouraging factor to them.
interesting.
If we lived in a country that was coherently white, and I'm not talking about some sort of 100% purity. It could be very well like Japan. Japan has these sprinklings of non-Japanese. They're no threat to the essential fundamental Japaneseness of Japanese society. But if white people knew that they were in a society that valued them, that saw them as the forebears of the next generation and the next generation, rather than as bearers of some kind of eternal and endless ancestral guilt that is oppressing every other group in the world, I think that might encourage a certain amount of baby making too.
Well, let's talk numbers because you talked about Japan, and I don't know what percentage is Japanese in Japan, but you were the sprinkling of diversity in Japan. What is
That's
an ideal percentage to focus on, to have
oh,
one ethnic group be the majority?
I don't know. I don't think it's really very useful to talk about precise percentages, and people get into these debates as to, well, if we ever get an ethno state, well, what about somebody who is quarter Japanese or 1/8 black? I don't think these are very useful questions. My sense of who would belong in a white ethno state is really whoever sincerely thinks of himself as a man of the West, and such a
Okay.
person might not even be white. I don't
Right.
know. There
Well, that's
is,
what I'm not talking about bloodlines and percentage of whiteness.
right.
I'm talking about what percentage of the country would you want to be white? If you could
Well,
choose, I mean, obviously
oh,
nobody's in control of these things at a certain point.
no. I think, well, gosh,
What, where,
in the case of Japan, I believe it's at least 95% ethnically Japanese, and then there's another sprinkling of people who are, and some of that remaining 5% are Koreans who are Japanese citizens and who are utterly indistinguishable from the Japanese, but the Japanese still care about that difference. They track them down with, if somebody's getting married, on sort of a slightly dubious name, somebody might hire a private detective and say, oh gosh, these folks had Korean ancestors after all. This practice is beginning to die out now, but that's been a traditional practice among the Japanese, who don't even want to mix with people who are, at least from a visual inspection point of view, utterly indistinguishable from themselves. I don't know, 90, 95%. I think in any case, a society must have some sense that, yes, this society is going to reflect our values. I keep coming back to the Hungarians or the Poles. I don't know what percentage of non-Hungarians or non-Poles or non-whites live in those societies, but at the highest level of Polish or Hungarian or Czech or Slovak society, you have a commitment to maintaining that national heritage. And that's what it takes. I don't think the numbers are nearly as important as a commitment in society through and through all the institutions to recognize that, yes, we are a valuable group of people. Our traditions are priceless, and we must do whatever it takes to preserve them.
I agree that sense of identity and self-esteem is important, and the numbers can be the numbers. I mean, for me, I think I lean nowhere near 90. I'm more around 70, 75 would be sort of a place that I would see as being a good area. Now, of course, everything is in flux. History always changes. Migration of people, birth rates, etc. I understand all that. But if you look at the top 10 countries in the world, they're all white majority countries outside of Korea and Japan. So that's not a coincidence. And if you
No.
stop being a white majority country, there's no way you're going to be on the top 10 list of this world. That's why America isn't, by the way. America is not anywhere near the top 25 countries on the earth in terms of livability.
Well, when I talk to interviewers, one of the things I like to tell them about the future of the United States is there's only one statistic you really need to know about what's going to happen in the United States in the next several decades. And that is that even after you factor in dropout rates, and blacks and Hispanics will drop out of high school at considerably higher rates than whites or Asians, by the time they get to the 12th grade, those blacks and Hispanics who are still in high school are reading and doing math at approximately the 8th grade level for whites and Asians. And this is something that you find essentially across the board in the entire United States. And as the United States becomes increasingly Hispanic and black, what kind of world-beating economy are you going to have with a group that is performing essentially 4 years behind while they're still in high school? This is a gap that will persist, of course, throughout the economy, throughout the age cohort. And this is the future that we are building up for our own children by changing the demographics of this country.
Now, I agree that if you wanted to form your country based off, intellectual performance or economic performance, you could organize it in such a way that it could excel, but that's not exactly how human societies work. I mean, there are people who have value in other ways that not necessarily is going to come out with IQ or, how much money they have.
That's certainly true. But what the Canadians claim to be doing by choosing an immigrant stream that is based on qualifications, ability, that's vastly better, of course, than this system we have, whereby it's either family unification, which is known as chain migration, or whoever can sneak across. What a crazy cockeyed, or win the lottery.
Jared,
what more goofy system could you have?
What about that phrase, bring us your huddled masses? Will you pour? What is that? We should chip that off the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, gosh. That's a subsequent addition. The Statue of Liberty, it was to commemorate 100 years of the existence of the United States, a gift of the French people. Its name is Liberty Enlightening the World. It's not Liberty Inviting the World. That thing was tacked on some decades later. Do we really want the wretched refuse of your team? What foolishness is this?
It's almost the exact opposite immigration policy of Australia, which is like, be a brain surgeon or get the F out, basically, is the policy.
Well, but then again, what does that do? What does that do to middle class or lower middle class or working class Australians? I understand that professions such as dentist or accountant, these are being completely dominated now by Chinese. And is that fair to Australians? I don't think it is. And if the reverse process were taking place in any non-white countries, there would be it just wouldn't be permitted to happen. I think whites deserve a society in which everybody gets a chance like they always used to, and not in one in which certain upper levels of society have been dominated by newcomers.
Yeah, it is comical down there. Have you been down there recently? I've been living in Melbourne.
I was in Australia only once about 5 years ago. I really quite enjoyed it. What shocked me was the lack of what looked like zoning. You had all different kinds of things, nice little residential houses, but then all of a sudden you'd have a parking lot or a gas station. The zoning was very poor.
There's a mix of new and old there, but the cities are wonderful, and it's a great country. And I think that's part of the problem, is that they haven't been exposed to what's to come. And so they have the luxury of pretending like it's all going to work out for the best when it's probably not.
Well, I've often said this, if there are two races of people that can live together in relative amity, it is whites and East Asians.
Correct.
They seem to get along reasonably well. That doesn't mean that I want my people to be replaced by East Asians any more than I'm sure East Asians want to be replaced by us. But if you are going to force two different groups or invite two different groups to live together, that is the combination that is likely to have the most success.
And it makes perfect sense. Now, let me rattle off some questions at you, because I have been ignoring my list here. Let us talk about testosterone. Point blank, do black people have more testosterone on average?
Yes, they do. That's well established.
That's not controversial in any way. And is it significant?
Not among scientists. Yes, so it's measurable and significant. And Unfortunately, the combination of high testosterone and low IQ
Mm,
tends to lead to criminality. Uh,
right. But
it's
that's
just
not in dispute either, though. If you take
no,
race out of it, if you have a low IQ and high testosterone,
right.
your likelihood you're going to be criminal and aggressive and violent
That's
skyrockets.
right. Well,
So,
it's skyrocket. I mean, I don't know what the trend line looks like, but
well,
there's there's a real correlation there that no one would deny, so long as you say, you leave race out of it.
okay, but nobody is shocked when if you hear about some violent act and it's a guy, it's a young
Right.
man. We know why young men tend to do this. It's not a coincidence.
That's right. It's not old women.
Right. And so, but why is this scientific fact, which seems to be at the core of a lot of what's being discussed, it gets completely ignored?
Well,
But
we
it's
know why.
okay, we do know why, right? It's a rhetorical
Yes.
question. Right.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's funny because it seems like all the facts are there and it would take just a basic sort of understanding to connect these dots.
Well, it's called pattern recognition.
Right.
And human beings are good at pattern recognition, but it's almost as if the people that run the country and runs the media suddenly lose about 50 IQ points when it comes to recognizing certain patterns.
I mean, if we notice that who are the cops arresting for murder or for assault?
Mm,
Well, it's
mm,
men. It's 95% men.
mm.
Nobody says that's systemic sexism, that
That's
that's
right.
the reason that's happening. We
Yeah.
know why it happens, and there's scientific reasoning behind it. That's a real frustration for me because all the time we spend wasted
Mm,
trying to explain this, do damage control on the stupid
yes.
theories people pump out there. It's time we could be
Yes.
spending doing something else useful and productive.
No, it's like all of these statistics about blacks being suspended from school at higher rates than white children or Asian children.
Mhm.
This is ipso facto evidence of racist teachers. We're not allowed even to conceive of the
Oh,
idea. Well, gosh, maybe they're committing, maybe their behavior is more likely to result in suspension because they behave differently. This is
oh,
off the table as a possibility.
I know. You know what's great about that is half the time
Mm,
people criticize the performance of black people in schools, it'll be like some
mm.
school in Baltimore, and they fail to mention that the teachers are black, the principal is black, the faculty is black, the mayor's black. This whole thing is black, but none of them. It's like they're saying they can't run and operate a school, and their students and
But
parents can't. Mhm.
don't forget, they live in a white supremacist
Right.
society that in many mysterious ways is forcing them down. That is the
Yeah, it's
explanation.
it's something about the property taxes and the schools are underfunded because the evil white man is, twisting his mustache. And I mean, have you ever seen footage of black schools? It's insane what's going on there. I mean, it's just the norm is just completely off the charts. Let me
Uh,
let me switch up though. Let me ask you about something completely off topic. Who is your favorite James Bond?
my favorite James Bond.
Yeah.
Gosh, I am not much of a consumer of popular culture, but I suppose the only James Bond that I ever really watched was Sean Connery. Uh,
Aha. That is the correct
yes.
answer, I'm afraid. Yeah,
Oh,
he was awesome. I mean, there's a lot of people that consider you to be like a Bond villain. Have you ever heard that before?
yes, just recently, and I do love to have my cat perch on my knees and fondle my cat. Isn't there some Bond villain who does that?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
a hairless cat. That would be amazing if you could do a photo shoot with the hairless
ooh, no hair. I don't like hairless cats, but my cat has fur, and
cat.
I've been forbidden by my producer, my assistant, to do that because you can hear the cat purring on the audio, and he's a very real purist about this sort of thing.
Do you
No
think
integration when it comes to species on the audio.
do you think we should separate black and white cats? Do you think it's racist that black cats are seen as a omen of bad luck?
Well, if you have cats and dogs in your
Oh,
house, you might be
mhm.
better off with animal apartheid. That's true.
Interesting. So, if they did make a James Bond as a black guy, which there's talk
Yes,
of this, do
yes.
you think that's the final straw, and that we should just head to the streets and just say, okay, enough is enough? If you take our
Wh-
James Bond,
White people never riot. That's one of our great defects.
well, you know that they try to describe celebrations of sporting events as riots because
Yes,
they
yes.
say like, oh, the Canucks won the Stanley Cup and they went out and partied a bit, and oh, that was a
Right.
riot too. It's not exactly comparable.
No, it's not. No, a little teenage exuberance or team support exuberance. Oh my, look at those white people. It's another race riot. Now, white people are rioting again. No, they're not comparable at all.
I want to talk about something on your Wikipedia, which it sits up there and they're trying to stain your reputation. And I just want to give you a chance to further explain yourself. You say on there, blacks and whites are different, which is okay. You say when blacks are left entirely to their own devices, Western civilization, any kind of civilization, disappears. Now, I assume you're being hyperbolic, but could you explain what you meant by any kind of civilization disappears?
Well, that is probably the harshest thing that I've ever written about Black people. And I wrote that in a long account of what happened in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And as we know, New Orleans fell into a state of almost total collapse. You had people firing on rescue helicopters. When you had people in the Superdome there, is that what it's called? It's, in any case, the stadium, and people in the convention center. It just fell into complete anarchy. And this was something that happened overnight. And it was in that context that I said that when blacks are left entirely to their own devices, let's imagine that Superdome full of nothing but white people. You would not have had the horror at night, the inability of women to go to the restroom without 4 or 5 men guarding them on their way. You would not have had a pillaging of the place. You would have had organization of games for the children. You would have had security. You would have had equitable distribution of food. You'd have had nothing like what happened in that Superdome, which was overwhelmingly black.
Well,
I mean,
the point
it may be unkind to point that out. Or you could have Japanese in the Super Bowl. There'd be even better organization. There would be even better security.
Do you remember the earthquake in Japan?
Oh, yes.
I remember very distinctly they were filming in the aftermath of that, filming a single person line that stretched on for half a mile of Japanese people waiting to get supplies from a store. And the helicopter guy, they're filming all this, tsunami and all the devastation. But then the story became, look at these Japanese people being so calm and patient and organized. There's no looting. There's no craziness.
That's right.
It was insane. I mean, man, so I hear what you're saying, but yeah, it is not kosher to say this. It's not nice.
No. And, it's perhaps perhaps it is incorrect to say blacks left to their own devices will not have what we would call a civilization. And yet, if you look, because at the present time, blacks are never left entirely to their own devices at all. Even in the midst of the Congolese jungle, you have semi-automatic rifles, you have portable generators, you have chainsaws. So they are not left to their own devices in that sense. But if blacks really, even if you did give them portable generators and chainsaws, if they're entirely on their own, is there going to be something that we would call a civilization? That is, I agree, a very harsh thing to say. But in history, if you look at what was found south of the Sahara, there is a remarkable poverty of what we would call culture and civilization. Not a single mechanical device. Only in the sort of in parts of Ethiopia do you have something that could be even remotely described as a written language. You don't have 2-story occupied buildings. No domesticated animals, for heaven's sake.
Those things are stark and true. I mean, I will say that my family has studied and preserved African music, and so they did have a tradition of musicality that is, very distinct and very valuable piece of culture.
That's right.
But yeah, these other things, the written word and
the wheel, for example, or a calendar. No, it didn't have that. No, but that's true. There's unquestionably the fact that African rhythms tend to be far more complex than Western rhythms. And musicologists would come down and say, gosh, this is written in 15/16 time, and it varies to 7/4 time. The rhythms are very sophisticated. And a friend who lives in South Africa informs me that many Black South Africans are capable of singing in harmony, just spontaneously. They can do this without any kind of training at all. Whereas for whites, this is not an easy thing. You have to really work at it to sing in harmony. But in any case, But you quoted from me what is, as I said, my harshest thing I've ever written about blacks. And I say blacks and whites are different. That's the point.
But
they
I think
are different.
Just for PR or something, I think what people are longing to hear from you is just some, positive statements about blacks, basically, is to say, look, there are many millions upon millions of amazing Black people who do amazing things, and they are inherently valuable as human beings, and they just want to even the score in terms of energy.
I have written an entire essay called "What I Like About Black People."
Right. Yeah.
It appeared.
Is it two sentences or what? How long is it?
No. It's a techie magazine.
It's a haiku.
No, for heaven's sake.
Okay.
I think, well, if you're talking, let's talk about American blacks.
Right.
I think American blacks have a kind of uninhibitedness, a kind of spontaneity,
Swagger.
a kind of generosity even that's very unusual among whites. I noticed this when I was whenever I wear a hat.
Mhm.
I'm beginning to lose my hair, and I'm supposed to stay out of the sun because, we Nordics are not very good in the sun. Get too much sun, bad things begin to happen. Well, it's only black people who will compliment me on my hat. Cool hat, man. Hey, where'd you get that lid? There's a kind of friendliness, a spontaneity about it. And whenever you get blacks together at a party, they'll dance. White people just sort of stand around and drink cocktails. I like this kind of uninhibitedness, spontaneity. Of course, there are unfortunate consequences of that if you get too spontaneous and too uninhibited around a bank teller. But I think also blacks are clearly better athletes in certain sports than whites. They have a kind of musicality. Another music instructor that I was pretty good friends with for a while. She taught music in New York City schools, and when you're teaching band to white children, a lot of them rush the beat. They want to they're really careful. They really don't want to miss the beat. And so they actually come in a little ahead of it. She says, the black children never miss the beat. They're always on the beat. She says, it's just uncanny. I mean, of course, I'm sure if you looked high and low, you could find a black kid who's off the beat. But there are things that they can do better than we can. But the point is, they're different. And I want black people to be the best possible black people they can be and not live in some sort of society in which there's this constant jockeying and jostling and one-upmanship. I want them to be happy, successful, and bring out what is the very best in their society. And they cannot do that. They cannot do that in a society in which they are absolutely convinced that we are scheming to bring them down. And I think many are convinced of that.
It's the victim narrative, and I think that's very commendable. I agree with what you're saying. It reminds me, you were deep in the trenches on a Queen Latifah show a few years back. Oh my Lord. And the topic was racial profiling, and you were giving a very common sense explanation as to why this is necessary and makes sense. And a woman got up and said, I don't know if you remember this, she said, oh, if you think black people commit more crimes, what about Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy? I mean, it was the most amazing argument, but you did a brilliant spin on it, and you told her, well, yes, that's a good point, because I think we should racially profile serial killers as being white, because they usually are. And so you proved the point to her. It was an amazing moment. Do you remember that interview?
Now that you bring it back. The fact is, though, I have since learned that that's not even true.
Well,
I thought it was true in terms of the statistics on serial killers. On a per capita basis, blacks are more likely to be serial killers than whites. I wasn't aware of that at the time. Of course,
I guess it depends if you're eating your prey, or I mean, are they including gangsters and serial killers? I mean, because there's a bunch of them.
No. There's a difference between mass shootings and serial killers. Serial killers, this particular sort of one at a time, this perverse way of going about it. No, well, if white people set their mind to being evil, if you've got a high IQ group, boy, they're going to be doing some very tricky, evil things, like that guy that started shooting up the folks at the concert in Las Vegas. You get white guy deciding he's going to kill as many people as possible. And what did he kill? 55, 60 people and wounded several hundred? Oof, no.
Shooting up a country concert, is that not an act of racism towards white people? I guess because he was white, it's just not seen as that. But in any other context, I mean, if it was an R&B concert, wouldn't the entire narrative be it's racism?
Yes, of course it would. It's surprising to me that there's almost no speculation these days on what his motive actually was. You'd think that a guy who really set the record would there'd be a fair amount of analysis about him. But once all the shooting and the shouting died down, there's really not much about that. I can't even remember his name.
Well, I don't even think we need to glorify him, right? Because did he leave
No,
a
no,
manifesto? Like, it's a
no,
disgusting
not at
chapter of
all.
American history. Yeah.
No, no, not at all. Maybe he was atoning for white privilege for all I know. I don't know, but there's practically nothing about his motive.
Well, and also he was very wealthy, which is a weird thing. So he had something to live for. You thought he could have maybe
Mm,
lived out his golden years, but no,
mm,
he decided to go
mm.
out. That's disgusting. Now, speaking of disgusting, there's a fat brown buffalo who goes by the name Cenk Uygur. You did an interview with him in which you absolutely destroyed him. It was comical. Do you remember this thing? This is the Young Turks. It's up on YouTube. Have I lost you? Hello, hello. Well, let's see if he reconnects. Um, Either that or he is engaging in a extended dramatic pause, which, if that's the case, I commend him for that. If this is still live, let me check. It looks like we're still live. All right. I'm gonna fire off an email to him and say, knocked out? Where did he go? I want to hear his take on Cenk and that interview because it is just embarrassing. I don't even think the Young Turks keep it up because I don't see what the point of it would be. Like, it's seriously not good, not good at all for them. And it's one of those things where, like, this was before the Young Turks were super big, and Cenk thought he was, I don't know, high on his horse, and he could just sort of, take on all comers. And I'm gonna
Hello?
shoot. Hey, Jared, hi.
Yes, I think
Back to it.
my internet connection went toes up.
Well,
I'm
it was
very
cool.
sorry.
It was probably Zuckerberg. Let's be honest. Um, so I was just asking about Cenk Uygur and the Young Turks. Do you remember appearing on that
Oh,
show?
yes, yes, I do. I shouldn't have hung up on the guy.
What is your recollection of that? Because I felt like you absolutely humiliated him and destroyed him on every single point.
Well, I thought I got the better of him on all his arguments, but then he started calling me stupid, and
Right.
I thought that was very impolite, and so I hung up on him. What I should have said, perhaps in Turkey, it's acceptable to call your guests stupid, but in the United States, you don't expect them to stay on if you insult them to their face like that. And I give you one more chance. If you'd like to
Mhm.
continue this interview, you may be polite. Otherwise, I'm going to hang up.
Yeah, and that's a great point. This is what I call the platinum rule, which is don't be an asshole. Now, if we can have people abiding by the platinum rule and the golden rule, I don't think anybody's going to have a problem. And that's why I find it odd that white people are made to be the devils of this situation when white people get along with so many different groups of people. And there's examples of this in country after country. So really, is white people, are we the variable here that's making this not work when it comes to blacks and whites? I
There
don't think it
is
is.
no there is no mixed society in which people get along in a wonderful way with blacks. These days, the real racial tension that you have in schools, where you have riots, or prisons, if you have riots, or cities, if you have riots, it's blacks and Hispanics. They are more likely to be into forced contact in a way that results in this kind of violence. Prison riots are a very, very interesting indicator of how our society works.
Yeah, that's
All
true.
prisoners, practically without exception, would love to be segregated by race. Race is a constant sort of source of tension. It's the worst possible fault line. It's not as though the Methodists and the Baptists are diligently killing each other. It's the blacks and
Mhm.
Hispanics and the Asians. They want to be segregated by race, but our society does not permit that. And so they're stuck in together, but we have to be constantly maneuvering to make sure that at least they have their turf, and the guards make sure that they don't release everybody together out into the
Mhm.
common areas at the same time. It's a constant balancing act, but the violent dividing line is race. And
Yeah, I see that. I see.
back to this question of blacks, there is really no group that gets along very well with blacks. Where you have blacks and American Indians going to school together, you have conflict, you have violence. Even
Mhm.
blacks in Minnesota and the Somalis that have taken a living in Minnesota, they don't get along with each other. It's a very, very difficult thing. And as I said earlier, the two groups that do seem to get along well are East Asians and whites. But once you get aside from that, then you're always going to have tension once you have enough numbers and they establish their own loyalty and their own communities they're separate from each other.
Now, I hear what you're saying, and I think it makes sense and it's true. But there are some things we can notice, such as blacks and
Hmm.
whites get along better in Great Britain. than they do in America. Now, you could chalk this up to the history of America. You could chalk it up to just the people involved, or just the success in which Britain has done in assimilating its citizens, perhaps. But is it not a good thing for us to focus on how we can improve the situation instead of what you're saying, which is to say, look, it's a divorce, irreconcilable differences, let's go our separate ways?
Are you really sure blacks and whites get along better in Britain? I know that the crime rates of blacks in London, for example, are very equivalent to the crime rates of blacks in New York City. And
Yes.
somehow the idea, whenever they've had these riots,
Mhm.
it's largely blacks. It's the same dynamic as in the United States. The police arrest some violent black guy, and he's mishandled in some way. He dies in police custody, and the place goes up in flames.
Well,
What leads you to say that blacks and whites get along better in Britain than in the United States?
well, I'm a citizen of both countries, and I've spent time in both. But I hear what you're saying. I mean, Britain also has the Muslim factor, which tends to, the conversation
Yes,
usually drifts off into what are the Muslims up to instead of the black versus white thing.
right,
But just the
right.
consciousness in Britain, it's far less I'm black and British. And you could see it just in the fact they don't say I'm African British, whereas we have African Americans. There's no African British. They understand that they're black. They're not in any denial of that. But
Hmm.
being British means something to them, and they are therefore united in a tribal way with other British people. And could it not be said that this is a good thing?
Well, it may have to do with if that's to the extent that is true, and
Mhm.
I will provisionally accept your assessment of that. To the extent
Okay.
that is true, it may very well be because there are not as many blacks in Britain as there are in the
Yeah.
United States, so they don't
And
have
I
this
would,
huge base for establishing solidarity and
yes,
separateness.
I would grant you that. I mean, look, Germany, we have a couple blacks, and they're so unbelievably outnumbered that it's assimilate. They have to assimilate. They have no
Right,
choice. So
right.
they don't form this alternate identity that's counter to the majority identity, and they have a chip on their shoulder. They just don't care, which is a good thing. I mean, I want to get to a place where we stop caring about this so much, but I feel like we're forced to care now at this point.
Well, this is what I believe essentially an inevitable pattern when there
Mhm.
are newcomers in very small groups. As you say, they have no choice. There is no community of co-racialists or co-religionists or
Mhm.
co-nationalists. They have to fit in and assimilate. And assimilation at that level can take place. But once there is this critical mass, then I think the loyalties that then come to rise are based in biology. There are
Yeah.
this biological sense of rootedness of tribe, and if there is enough biological soil for the roots of tribe to begin to grow, they will grow.
Here's a quick question, just jumps into my mind. What percentage of countries on this planet could safely be called ethno-states already,
Hmm.
currently?
Hmm. Oh, I would guess that, 30, 40, 50, maybe more than half. It depends, of course, on how you define an ethno-state. You might say that in some respects, practically every sub-Saharan African country is an ethno-state to the extent that they are all black, but they're divided
Mhm.
by tribe. And so you might say, well, there are no ethno-states in Africa. It all depends on how you define it. Saudi Arabia or Tunisia, Algeria, those are pretty nearly ethno-states. I'd
Mhm.
have to think about it country by country. And
Mhm.
it's also important to realize that people focus on the dangers of diversity in the United States and assume that a big part of the problem is the simple fact of diversity. But you can have uniformity. But
Mhm.
if the group that is uniform is not of a very productive level, then you can have homogeneity with an unsuccessful country too, of which Haiti would be a good example.
Right, right. I could see that. Um, so I get a sense that people are, at least white people that I know of, are getting sick of being demonized constantly and being insulted. And I, I'm just trying to figure out what the next step is because I've lived through riots and stuff, and I hear the bloodlust. It's really nasty, and these people are being spread lies. They're being told, "Oh, these racist white people are out to get you, and they're the white devils, and they're Neanderthals, and we got to stop them." Do you think there will be bloodshed in any significant way in the next 5 years? It
I
seems to be going that
certainly
way.
I certainly hope not.
Yeah.
Although I would not be surprised if there is significant bloodshed. After all, If you wanted to teach black people to hate white people, you would do exactly what
Mm,
American society does.
mm.
Constantly blame us for everything that goes wrong. Our message to black people is, okay, so you're more likely to be in jail. You're more likely to be poor. You know why? It's those nasty, nasty white people over there. The
Yeah,
teachers are racist. The police are racist. The government is racist. Everybody is racist. They are your problem. My gosh, it's shocking to me that there isn't more anti-white
yeah,
racial
right.
killing and rioting. It
So they
constant
position us,
message.
yeah, they position us as an affront to their entire lives. Like we
Yes,
are hell bent on preventing them from achieving or being happy. I mean, of course, we're going to be the number one villain in their mind.
yes.
Now, I see
Well,
that you.
I would point out a remarkable thing about that is it's not just black people who will say that. You can find loads and loads of white people who will say, yes, we are so awful. People that look like
Yeah,
me are the ones that are at the heart of everything that's ever gone wrong for your people anywhere, anytime in history of the world.
it's
White people
pathetic.
are saying that. Why wouldn't they believe it?
I know. I make fun of these people all the time. I try to name and shame them. But as
Mm,
far as your building of a movement to sort of speak honestly about this and to, I don't know, take political action or just raise consciousness, you
mm,
seem to be, you're on the right side politically, and you seem to associate with mostly people on the right. Now, I am on the left, and
mm,
there's many people who agree with me who are conscious about the things you speak of, who are not, going to be weak or pretend or delude ourselves about race. I'm not self-hating. I'm happy that I'm white. I don't think that white people should be disparaged like this in an ongoing fashion. Why are you guys not reaching out to those of us on the left who are on the same side? We agree, and you and I might
well,
disagree on taxes and healthcare or whatnot, but what does
mm,
that have to do with
mm.
race? Why is race
It has
political?
nothing. It has nothing at all to do with race. And I don't feel
Mhm,
as though I am speaking in a way that would reject people on the left.
mhm,
We published, I think, an important article in American Renaissance some years ago called "Don't Write Off the Left," and it was by a woman who
mhm.
is a woman of the left, who believes in high taxes, doesn't like the Second Amendment. She thinks the Swedish cradle-to-grave welfare is a wonderful thing. That she's a feminist, but she thinks, look, we can still have common ground when it comes to race. I think that's absolutely 100% true. And traditionally in the United States, there was an understanding of race that was universal. Jack London, he was very much of a lefty and a socialist, but he was
Mhm.
very much a racially conscious white guy. The labor movement was very racially conscious. So
Mhm.
there is absolutely nothing at all inherent about a sensible understanding of race that makes it either conservative or liberal or right or left. It
Interesting.
is something that is now generally associated with conservatism for a whole host of interesting historical reasons, but there is no logical need for that at all. I think that it largely has to do with the fact that racial egalitarianism is sort of the mother lode of egalitarianism in general. And the attempt to do away with genetics, to assume that the environment is the cause of all differences in society that we see, and therefore the environment has to be tuned so that we can get rid of inequality. That is sort of a vaguely leftist idea, and I think
Okay.
that is why a misunderstanding about race is associated with the left. But there is nothing at all logical or
Mhm.
inevitable about the left being associated with delusions about race, and that was not always the case at all.
Yeah, I agree, and thank
But
you for
but
saying
let
that
but let
because
me let me ask you this: would you say that my message, for example, is somehow pitched to the right or to conservatives rather than to liberals? Because if that's so, I would wish to modify.
well, I mean, in many interviews, you're going to bring up Trump, or at least they bring up Trump, and
Hmm,
that is, very repellent to me personally, and it's just an unnecessary distraction, and it gets you off topic.
hmm,
And not to mention, you associate with so many people on the right that it feels like, if you're white and you are not, if you want to be a pussy about being white, if you are proudly or just not self-loathing white, then you have to be on the right, which just to me doesn't make any sense at all. And I criticize
no,
the left for this. I understand the left is the anti-white side if you're going to choose it like that.
Yes, certainly. The worst firepower of criticism comes from the left,
Mm,
but I'm perfectly open to people who have any kind of political or religious beliefs,
yes.
commitments, ideologies. The basic building block of what would be an ethno state would be race, and if we are to have a state, a nation of white people, we're going to have all kinds. There's going to be left, right, center. There's going to be forward and backwards. There are going to be homosexuals, heterosexuals, religious people, irreligious people.
Well,
That's the nature of a nation, and that's
okay.
all part of the family. And maybe it is the case that when white people are left to their own devices, they do have Scandinavian-style cradle-to-grave socialism, or maybe white people left to their own devices have rugged individualism like 19th century America, or maybe either or both or a mixture or anything in between. I'm not
Okay.
in a position to say, I mean, I may have preferences, but the last thing I want to do is to say, okay, white society's got to be like this. I just want the opportunity for white people to have a society that is their very own.
Okay. Now, speaking of this ethno state, which you're envisioning, here's a very important question: should we let Sargon of Akkad in? Is he white? Because he has said that his father is half black. Now, in his defense, he cannot dance and he's no good at the 100-meter dash. So we should factor that in.
As I say, I'm not a big one on purity. I had a conversation with Sargon of Akkad. He treated me, I think, in an entirely gentlemanly way. I had
Mhm.
no notion that he was anything other than white. I'm not a sort of a genetic policeman on this.
Well, we'll put a swab in his mouth and we'll send it over to the 23andMe people.
Right. Yes, yes.
Let me talk to you about O.J. Simpson.
Mm.
At a freak of my personal life, I was at the O.J. Simpson case during the closing arguments,
Oh,
and I
oh.
made eye contact with him, and I happened to be sitting next to Richard Dreyfuss, the actor, so the news cameras were focused on me. Now,
Hmm.
would it shock you to know? Let me ask you, just to take a guess.
Hmm.
They did a study. They said how many people today by race think O.J. Simpson is innocent after all the evidence. Today, they think he's innocent. What percentage of blacks and whites you think he's
Hmm.
innocent?
Now that's very interesting. My guess is that, oh, I could be way off, but my guess is that maybe 25 to 30% of whites think he's innocent, and maybe 65, 70% of blacks think he's innocent. Prove me
Well,
wrong.
okay, it's 43% of blacks and 17% of whites, but
Think he's
comparatively,
innocent. Hmm.
yeah, which is shocking to me
Hmm.
on every level. Every
Yeah.
single one of those people I want to sit down and have a long talk to. But is that not the problem? Is that not a sign of the apocalypse that many people think O.J. Simpson's innocent? I mean, are we
Well,
not just doomed?
I'm pleasantly surprised that the number's that few. Uh, if you asked black people whether when Michael Brown was shot, he had his
Yeah.
arms up and he was saying, "Don't shoot, please." I wonder what the
Mhm.
percentage would be for that. But no,
Yeah,
I'm pleasantly surprised that the numbers who think he's innocent
but
are that small.
it's mass delusion. I have a question. I don't know the answer to this one, but what percentage of blacks think that Egyptians were black? And why do they want
Mm.
that to be true?
You know, it's probably a pretty good number. This is
Mhm.
something that I used to be invited on black radio stations. That was a very frustrating thing because you have a very hard time getting through on any kind of logical argument. I remember more than one occasion trying to explain the concept of proportions. In other words, yes, there are in fact more white people on welfare than black people, but on a per capita basis, there are 5 times as many black people on welfare than white people. But that just wouldn't go through. It just wouldn't go through. And when, oh, the whole question of people want to take pride in their ancestry. That's a very simple thing to understand. And if you really do look at race historically and you look at the accomplishments of blacks, it's pretty harsh doctrine to say, well, look, black folks, even in the United States, you have an average IQ of 85, and back in your home continent, all you accomplished was this. That's very unpleasant. If I were
Mm,
black, I wouldn't want to have to live with that. And that's why Wakanda is so inspiring. That's why the idea that we built the pyramids, we was kings, all that
yeah.
is very appealing and
It's
invigorating. The
understandable.
idea
Yeah.
also that the Greeks We had all this wonderful knowledge. The Greeks came along and stole our culture. Now, the idea that you could somehow steal a culture as if it were a physical object and leave nothing in behind, that's a very, very weird thing. But they stole our culture, and that's why we didn't have any left. But no, all that's perfectly understandable. And to me, the equivalent of this is making heroes out of Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and all of these other people who are dubious at best and thugs at worst. They're grasping for something that is positive about being black. Now, there are many positive things, but why they should choose that? It's sad. It's tragic almost.
It's tragic. I agree. Now, you don't have cooties. There's no Jared Taylor cooties. There's some airborne sickness. There's no disease.
No! I poison the air in any room I go into. I'm warning you.
Because I'm trying to understand why people with huge platforms like Sam Harris or Joe Rogan have never invited you on. Would you go on their shows? Is that something? Have you asked to go on their shows?
My motto is no soapbox too low. I'm in the missionary business. I would be delighted to be on their programs. But I did hear in a roundabout sort of way, I believe it was Sam Harris who, in a conversation with Douglas, that's exactly right. Murray said something about how Stefan Molyneux had interviewed me, and that made Stefan Molyneux a pretty dangerous character. And there's certainly anyone who would actually interview me outright. Oh my gosh, that's sand in the spinach and just not to be tolerated. I don't understand. But
because it's like the thigh bone's connected to the leg bone, and then Taylor's connected to the Nazis apparently. So if you talk to you, it's just the gateway into the. I don't know. It's madness.
That's right.
But
I'm channeling the Fuhrer. Yes. Every word is straight out of Mein Kampf.
No, I can understand why Sam Harris doesn't want to talk about race. He's on record. It's like there's no benefit to him. He's going to, alienate half of his audience, lose a bunch of money, get smeared as being a racist. Having said that, he already had Charles Murray on because he felt an obligation to defend him as a fellow scientist who was not lying about the IQ results. Right. So if you've already talked to Charles Murray, Jesus, the founder of the bell curve, not that he invented it, but he just recognized it for what it is. Why not have him on? I don't understand it.
Because Charles Murray is a scientist and not an advocate. You can talk to Charles Murray and you can envisage the white coat and you can imagine the stethoscope around his neck. With me, that's not the case. I take these ideas and I want to implement them in the political realm. And the implications of what I say for what the United States has chosen to do for the last half century are simply horrifying. My vision of the future of the United States is one that is so dark and disturbing that most people don't even want to move, don't even want to look in that direction, much less absorb what they see. There is a difference in Sam Harris's defense in simply pointing out the science and then saying, well, okay, now that we recognize this, what does that mean about where we might have gone wrong in American society? Those are two very different steps.
Right. But I mean, even if you disagree with you and your opinions, you could still talk. It's
I would like to think so.
Yeah.
I'd like to think so.
I agree with everything, but I still talk to you. So I don't understand why they can't. But
well, I don't like to attribute motives to people, but that is my. I just don't know why. But I would certainly accept the opportunity to speak to Sam Harris or really any other host that has an audience. I'd be happy to do that. I mean, after all, if I can talk to Queen Latifah, I should certainly be able to talk to Sam Harris.
Well, you talked to Tariq Nasheed, and you made it through that, which I don't know how you made it through that.
You know, after that was over, I took him seriously the whole time. And then after it was over, I thought to myself, has this guy just been jiving me the whole time?
Yeah.
I think maybe he was. He was giving me the rope-a-dope.
Yeah, that was unbelievable. That's a piece of art right there. Now, I would love for you to explain this to me because you talk about white people, but really, I feel like most of the time it's a shortcut or just code for white people in America is what specifically you're talking about. Because, there are, as you know, there are gaping differences between the white peoples of Europe that are not going to be overlooked simply by noticing that they're all white. Like, for example, the Germans and the Russians are not going to be buddy all of a sudden. And because why would they be? They have historical grievances and vastly different cultures. So are you not trying to bite off more than you can chew by trying to unite white people across borders and cultures?
I don't think so. When the Russians and the Germans realize that both countries are threatened by Islam in a way, or by
Hmm.
depopulation by Chinese, or whatever it is, there are larger fish to fry. We will find that we do have this sense of being a worldwide brotherhood of Europeans. I have recently been giving talks in Europe, and I'm going in September, giving 3 different talks in 3 different places. The young people I find in Europe see and understand race exactly the same way young people do here in the United States. It is a conception that is absolutely a carbon copy. It's startling how close it is.
Hmm.
They realize the biological fundamental substrate of our heritage. They glory in their own differences. Germans and Dutchmen know that they are different, and they're
Hmm.
happy to be different. And in those parts of Europe where they have had any kind of large-scale contact with non-Europeans, their conception of the future of their continent is exactly the same. It's only in a place like Hungary, where there really is practically no non-white intrusion, that you find people debating, well, who do we hate most?
Well,
Is it the Slovaks or is it the Romanians?
I've spent,
Well,
yeah,
fellas, that's not the problem. That shouldn't be the problem.
I've,
But no, there is, I believe, it's, and of course, it's because I have contacts with people who do have similar views. But from South Africa to New Zealand to
mhm.
Canada to all the countries in Western Europe that I've ever set foot in, you can find people whose conception of race is very much that of mine. And that's why, as I say, I like to talk about this worldwide brotherhood of Europeans. We are all in this together and face the same challenges of survival.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the Muslims, which is, a separate problem, but there's so many parallels because, if you're talking about clashes of, that have fault lines that is based on biology or history, this religious clash of the Islamic world invading the West. I mean, that is a problem that is shared by many nations. And would you suggest that, we should separate from Muslims as well? Is that the logical conclusion of your way of thinking?
It it certainly seems to me that any kind of serious Islam is incompatible with Western civilization, Western society.
Hmm.
We see evidence of this whenever you get large numbers of Muslims. And I read a very eye-opening book about Islam that talked about what is really in the Quran and the way Muhammad actually conceived of the religion. There's never been, I think, a more bloodthirsty and cruel founder of a major religion in the history of the world. This guy, he's absolutely at the opposite extreme from Jesus Christ, for example.
Yeah.
Islam really is based on a totalitarian view of society and of the entire world. I
Hmm.
don't think that it's really compatible with anything that is non-Islamic, much less Western, at least if it's taken seriously the way the Quran, I believe, is intended to be taken seriously.
Yeah. I saw a video recently where they were trying to say the cure for racism is Islam because Islam doesn't care what race you
Well,
are, which they don't, but like they do care if you're
oh,
Islamic or not, or Muslim.
well, but it's not really a cure for racism either. When I
Yeah.
debated Sargon of Akkad, he made that very same argument. But the
Mm.
whole world, the name Abdullah, that means slave of Allah, Abd, and Abd is the Arabic word for black people. Wherever you find Islamic societies, you have had traditionally black African slavery. And
Mm.
in those rare circumstances in which people are on jihad together, there is a certain amount of solidarity that transcends race. But in every Islamic society that is more or less at peace, you will find racial distinctions. And throughout the history of Islam, read the Arabian Nights, the way
Mm.
blacks are considered, it's the most contemptuous sort of thing. And of course, the
Yeah.
reason why, despite the literally millions of sub-Saharan Africans who were taken into the Middle East and used as slaves over a period that lasted far, far, far longer than slavery in North America or in the New World. Despite that long history of slavery, there are practically no blacks or black heritage in the Middle East because so many of the male slaves were castrated. And if you had a black concubine and had a half Arab, half black child, those children were killed.
Hmm.
The treatment of blacks in Muslim society has really just been grotesque by any kind of world standards. And
Yeah,
to
I
say
don't.
that somehow Islam transcends race, no, not at all.
Yeah, I think it solves the problem of racism the same way solving the problem of your foot hurting by chopping off your leg. I mean, you have new problems that you're going to have to contend with immediately. Now, I have to understand what inspires you to continue to do what you do, because it comes at a great cost to you. Like, you could do something in the private sector and be without the constant attacks and negative energy hurled at you. Why do you continue? Why does this matter to you so much?
I feel a duty. I feel a duty to my ancestors and an obligation to my children. And it may be that my people and my tribe will just be washed away through immigration and through miscegenation. I can't, there's no guarantee of success. But even if that is the outcome, I don't even calculate the chances of success, because this is my duty. I owe it to my family. We make sacrifices for our family we make for no one else. And I'm prepared to do this, and I'm happy to have made this choice. I wish I had been much more successful, but really for the first time in the last, say, 5 years or so, I do see progress being made. There are more and more people who understand the world as I do, and and this is the fundamental point, who realize that it is morally unimpeachable for white people to stand up and to defend their own rights. This is a necessity. It's a necessity for me, and increasingly, it's a necessity for more and more people that I meet, especially young people.
And is that encouraging for you? Does that inspire you to continue
Very
doing what you do?
encouraging. Very
Mhm.
encouraging. When I'm put out to pasture, there'll be others who will take my place, and they will do a marvelous job.
Okay, let's touch briefly on the JQ, which to me is ridiculous to phrase something as the JQ as if there's a question that needs to be answered. But let me just tell you my stance. I'm pro-Israel completely, absolutely pro-Jewish. Have just great personal experiences with Jews. I see them as an absolute non-problem in the world. Exactly the opposite. They contribute disproportionately. They're brilliant, as you know. Their IQ scores, cultural, et cetera, et cetera. Why are people obsessed? Is it just this thing of anti-Semitism that we cannot rid this earth of? What is the deal?
Well,
Now, I recognize that Jews are disproportionately on the left and the far left.
mm,
Uh,
yes.
78% of Jews voted for Barack Obama and 71% voted for Hillary Clinton. Is it just that? Is it just that they are more vocal and represented in media? Why do people scapegoat them so much?
You'd have to ask them, of course.
Mhm.
But it is undeniable that Jews have been disproportionately represented in those ideological movements that have been used to undermine the legitimacy of any kind of white racial consciousness. You can go all the way back to Franz Boas, and he and his disciples were going into all the sociology and the anthropology departments all throughout the United States, teaching this egalitarian message. Now, I think there is I think a strain among certainly secular Jews to believe that they will be safest and that they will be least likely to attract attention in non-homogeneous societies. That we have to concede that Jews have a certain clannishness about them. They maintain their separateness, whether religious or ethnic, and intermarriage. And this kind of cohesion is less noticeable and less likely to attract unpleasant attention if it is in a society in which there's a mixture of all different kinds of people, where everything goes. And so I think that is one of the reasons why Jews have encouraged the creation of multicultural, multiracial states, because they will feel safer in such states. In fact, there have been a number of Jews who have made that quite explicit. Um, but
Mhm.
this is not to say that, and again, I should not try to speak for those who take that attitude towards Jews. But there is, as you point out, a preponderance of Jewish leftism and a
Mhm.
preponderance of the Jewish firepower that has gone into delegitimizing someone who would take my position. The
Interesting.
strongest critics, the fiercest, most determined, and the ones who seem to require the least sleep are Jews. Now,
Hmm.
they're not exclusively Jews, but people notice this and they don't like it. Now,
Right.
as far as the way Jews have organized Israel, Israel is in some respects the ideal ethno-state. It started with an idea that Jews they deserved a homeland.
Well,
To
having
me,
25% Arabs is probably not ideal under any.
it's
Uh,
not ideal. It's not
yeah,
ideal. See, and yet, see, that fits in with the figure that you quoted earlier. You can have an
yeah,
ethno state with 25%, but that's an unfortunate 25%.
yeah. That's
If that
right.
25% were, French Gentiles and, a
Hmm.
few Asians, it would be a completely different 25%.
Precisely.
But Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state. And I find it fascinating
Hmm.
that American politicians who will endorse the
Yeah,
Jewishness of Israel would be
yeah.
the first to turn right around and say that someone like me is basically a Nazi
Right. So
because I want a European America.
yeah, and you never hear this phrase, Jewish supremacy. If somebody's in favor of Israel existing, they don't say, "Oh, you Jewish supremacists." Of course, they call them all sorts of other bad names, but
Yes,
it's not
yes.
seen as some weird thing that they're concerned about their people.
No, no more than the Koreans are Korean supremacists. So they
Right.
just want to be left alone.
So the way you
Now,
describe
in
it,
the case,
it
yes,
sort of makes sense that Jews are a little bit suspicious of other ethnic groups that are in the majority because they're always a minority basically everywhere except
right,
for Israel.
right.
So they're representing their own interests. So in a way, it's perfectly rational that they would. I mean, look, it doesn't benefit me if they're going to try to disparage white people, left, right, and center. But if they don't consider themselves white
Well,
and separate from us, then doesn't it make sense that they would?
see, that's a very interesting element of the situation. I think more and more Jews are recognizing that to the extent that they promote these kind of anti-white ideologies, if
Mm,
they say, well, whoops, I'm a minority too. This rising tide of African or Hispanic color is not going to say, hey, you're white, buddy. I think more and more Jews are recognizing this. And Jews are well represented in the ranks of people who understand the biology of race and IQ, for example.
yeah.
Jews are going to be overrepresented in every intellectual endeavor because of their high IQ. And American Renaissance has always had Jewish participants and
Hmm.
collaborators and men who consider themselves absolutely part of the West. And the idea that somehow, because Jews in the aggregate have promoted some of these, what you could call anti-white ideologies, that
Mm.
all Jews are the enemy of the white race, I think that's just crazy. We need all the allies we can get, and some of them are going to be excellent allies.
I find it interesting with all this back and forth between whites and blacks and racism and slavery and oh my God, what's going on? Uh, there's been a silence with almost every other race. So you never, very rarely, do you hear a Hispanic or an Asian get up and say, "Here's what I think about the white-black thing in America. Here's why I think you guys should chill out, or here's where you're right and here's where you're wrong." They, I feel a lot of the other ethnic groups are happy to see the chaos and the sort of vitriol pointed back at white people. Their silence is deafening to me. Do you notice that? I feel like they're not
Oh,
represented in the conversation
well,
at all.
of course, many blacks in particular
Mhm.
have an idea that somehow, as the United States becomes increasingly non-white, it makes no difference who those non-whites are. That there's going to be this rainbow coalition to finally get the better of the white man.
Mm.
Well, this to me is an absolutely catastrophic position for black leaders to take.
Mhm.
As the country becomes more Hispanic or Asian, the newcomers are not going to sit still for sob stories about slavery and
Right.
lynching. No, no,
The
they've got their own
Chinese,
beefs. They
they
got
don't
their own
care.
agenda.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can see that.
Yes.
Now, I'm worried because I have family in South Africa and I've
Mm,
experienced firsthand, like my uncle, my aunt, they've been home invaded, attacked, beaten,
mm,
bloodied,
mm.
robbed, the whole thing. And with,
Probably by Swedish tourists, right?
of course, just on vacation, just happened to go on a wild
Right.
spree. But you see what's happening there, and now they're just taking the land back from the farmers, which is completely morally and legally unjustified. It's ridiculous. But is that not the future of America if the numbers dwindle to, if we get to 30%, 25%, what's to say that American life would not resemble life in South Africa in terms of violence levels, in terms of gated communities, private security, 50 murders a day, just these sort of numbers. Is that not a valid concern?
Well, of course, it's a valid concern, but the situation will not be as bad as Zimbabwe or South Africa because it won't be nothing but blacks.
Right.
I hate to make odious distinctions of this kind, But Hispanics will be a disagreeable set of overlords. Asians will be, I think, a disagreeable set of overlords, but they'll be overlords in entirely different sorts of ways.
Mhm.
We will not have the kind of monolithic opposition to whites that reaches that kind of level of barbarity. I do not think so. Of
Okay.
course, I do not at all rule out a Supreme Court with more Elena Kagans and Sonia Sotomayers on it, finding creative interpretations of the First Amendment that means that people who speak the things I do just go to jail, not only get kicked off the internet, but go to jail. I can even imagine a white privilege tax that's paid only by whites.
Oh,
After all, we have benefited from generations and generations of white supremacy and exploitation of non-whites. It's time for us to pay back what we owe.
Sure.
I can easily imagine certain professions, whites being barred, or that juries have to have a certain number of non-whites, can't have a majority. I mean, there are all kinds of things that you can imagine.
Well, didn't they do that thing in South Africa where it had to be whatever field, whatever industry, the demographics had to be proportional to the demographics of the nation? So,
yes,
all the people in engineering, if you had 10% whites in the country, you can only have 10% whites in those engineering jobs. And this has been a disaster, obviously.
yes, these things are very easy to imagine in the United States as well. And to somehow think that we're immune to this kind of revanchism, this sort of revenge taking, I think is utter fantasy. When I talk to liberals, which is not as nearly as often as I would like, to me it's fascinating to try to explore their minds and see what it is that is the basis for these ideas they have that I think are just so delusional. I ask them, do you really think that a majority non-white United States is going to be a pleasant place for your grandchildren? Some of them will, they will have to suppress a shudder as they try to imagine in any realistic way what's going to happen. But they feel morally compelled to stick to their view of the world. And that, I think, is the Achilles heel in certain respects of whites, is that they have to be absolutely convinced that what they're doing is moral. If you tell blacks, well, this is good for you, or Hispanics, affirmative action, racial preferences, this is good for you, I think the number of blacks are going to sit and say, well, wait a minute, is this fair? Is minuscule. But in the case of whites, we have to convince ourselves that what we're doing is fair. And that is, I think, the real problem with white advocacy, is the immediate assumption that anyone who is standing up and speaking in the interests of whites is immoral. This is deeply ingrained. And we have to convince white people that, yes, it is not only moral, it is something that is effectively your duty to stand up for your rights. No one else will. And if you don't, you'll be elbowed out of the way. And it'll be very unpleasant, not just for you, but for all succeeding generations of any whites who are left.
I view the whole thing as a bit tragic because I think that a lot of these people, their intentions are good, but they have malignant empathy. It's just they've taken it to a place that's not helpful to anyone. And they're literally avoiding reality and blaming anyone who describes reality as being the problem, which actually avoids the problem entirely.
It is a curious thing. There are so many whites who act as if they hate white people, that some people who are of the same mind as me about many things can't help but think that they do hate white people. Angela Merkel, for example, she doesn't hate white people. She thinks she's doing something moral, even though she is setting in motion a process that could destroy her country in the long term, as well as the entire continent. She doesn't hate white people, but if she did hate white people, I'm not sure she'd be doing anything different. There is this idea. White people think they are cloaked in righteousness when they are doing things that are objectively terribly, terribly damaging to their own people.
Yeah, and the whole thing is drenched in paternalistic racism, low expectations. It's just
there's a lot of that. Much of liberal conception of race treats blacks as if they were mere puppets, that we are in complete control, that they have no agency whatsoever. That if we move our little finger, that they all flop dead.
It's like a you break it, you buy it sort of philosophy. And us having slavery, we broke it, and so now it's ours. We got to control, help them back.
Oh, that's good. I'll have to steal that idea. I'll credit you.
Please do.
Mm.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
Um,
I'm afraid we're getting to the end of my allotted time. Unless there are a couple of questions that you desperately want me to
oh,
answer, I think we should be trudging towards the exit here.
okay, I will thank you for your time. I'll wrap up with maybe one final question then.
All right.
Let's try to end on a positive note. I understand your position. I understand your description of race relations and why things are the way they are. And I understand that your goal is to separate and your concern is for white people, which is why you're a white advocate. But to play devil's advocate, if
Mm.
you are committed to the project of multiculturalism, of having these groups of people work together, live together, because we've seen this be successful in pockets, in small doses, granted, what strategies might you employ? What advice would you have to people who are committed to this experiment known as America and to bonding together and overcoming racial differences?
Mm. You mean,
As a,
what would I do if I were a proponent of a multiracial America?
how could we practically make it work? Is there anything, or
Well,
are you convinced
well,
that we're
one thing. Well, I don't think it can work. I really don't think it can work. But if I were committed to making it work, I think one of the absolutely essential ingredients to that would be widespread acceptance and understanding of racial differences in ability and in IQ.
Mhm,
Until we have widespread understanding of that, every Black person thinks that his group is being cheated. There is
mhm,
this insuperable barrier to any kind of understanding. I mean, after all, part of growing up for all of us is a realization that no, we are not the highest IQ, the best athlete, the most successful with the girls,
yeah,
the best baseball player. No, we recognize that if somebody does better than us in a competition, it's because he beat me fair and square. We are
mhm,
constantly telling Black people, no, no, you've been cheated. You've been cheated. You're
mhm.
just as smart and hardworking as these white guys. But every time you turn around, you're being cheated and held back by these vicious people. That so long as Blacks are told that in a society, a multiracial society in which it is impossible to expect equality of outcome, you are destined to have
Mm,
one terrible problem after another. So if I were committed to multiracialism, which I am not, that would be
mhm.
my first step, is to say, look, folks, we have to deal with this frankly and truthfully. And that, it seems to me, would bring a certain amount of unprecedented peace to race
Right.
relations.
So
There's
you're
the
trying.
differences.
It's a great goal, and you're trying to raise consciousness. It's the same reason why trying to explain to someone that Michael Brown was not killed because he's black. He was killed because he was punching a police officer and going for his gun.
Yes,
Like
yes.
they've
Why
been
is that so
fed a
hard to
lie.
explain?
I know
Yes,
it's stunning. It's because they don't want that to be true in some weird
right.
way.
Yes,
And I think you're right. That would lessen the hatred from one group to another and the
yes.
reciprocal sort of negative feelings back at the people that hate the first group. I mean, the whole thing is a mess. Now,
No,
I
it
really,
sets off this vicious cycle. Yes.
I appreciate your time. I really had a fun time talking with you. The most important question that I can ask you, though, is your pronunciation of Cool Whip. Are you familiar with Cool Whip?
Unfortunately, I am.
You're not a fan of it?
No.
How does Jared Taylor pronounce that word, those words?
Well, as it should be pronounced, Cool Whip. How else would one? How else would one
But
pronounce such a word? I mean, we have to distinguish between WALE and WHALE,
I
or
mean,
WAIL, I suppose.
you are.
Yes, I mean, are we drinking? Are we drinking wine? No, we drink wine, and when we're fed bad wine, we might whine about it.
Well,
These are two different words. They deserve to be pronounced differently. I mean,
amazing. You
doesn't
put the
everybody talk
H in
that way?
white. You put the H in white people. It's fantastic. You're an advocate for the H, and I
Mm.
appreciate your tireless work on the topic.
On the yes, my tireless work on to the benefit of the H. Yes.
Well,
No,
this has
that's
been
just the
very.
way I grew up speaking. If I can provide merriment to people by some eccentricity about the way I was reared, that makes me happy.
Well, it's wonderful. I mean, you remind me of the kid. The emperor's wearing no clothes, right? Now, in that story, there was a small child who said, "Oh, the emperor's not wearing any clothes." You are like that child, except for you're older, wiser, and have a college education from Yale, and are eloquent. And now that's a problem for a lot of people who don't want to recognize that the emperor is not wearing clothing.
Well, I guess it is. But as I say, there are more and more people who are just as good at this as I am. And
Mhm.
I have confidence that this message will get through. There could be some concerted effort to completely kick us off the internet, shut down YouTube, deny
Mhm.
our domain names. I mean, ultimately, I suppose if Gmail, for example, is a private company, if it decided, hey, we're not going to give accounts to racists, we could have no email. Short of that kind of total blackout, and that could bring all sorts of unforeseeable consequences. Our message will get through, and I believe it
Okay.
will be recognized as the inevitable and necessary message that it is.
So you think the truth shall rise to the top and will be unstoppable in the end?
Ultimately, yes, I do
Mm.
believe that.
Well, thank you, Jared Taylor. I really appreciate your time, and I had a wonderful time chatting with you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right, then. Excellent.